withdrawing all support for development and now doing nothing to ease the penal planning restrictions on both domestic and ground-mounted solar installations. The President says merely that he expects installations to increase fivefold by 2035, but without any support to allow that expectation to become a reality. Isn't it time that the government took the contribution of solar can make to net zero targets seriously?
Well, Mr. Speaker, respectfully, I disagree with him. I mean, the government is doing an enormous amount on this issue. In the latest CFD auction process, solar is back in. He will know that we've already removed VAT on solar panels to allow installations of residential accommodation. And if he looks at the detail of what's been set out in the energy security strategy, he will see there is going to be a big focus on solar, on wind, and of course nuclear as well.
Caroline Anderson.
Question 2, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 2 and 7 together. COP26 was the first such conferences with a significant presence from the private sector, as well as key corporate commitments to tackle climate change. For example, over 7,000 international companies have signed up to the Race to Zero campaign, committing them to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to the Met Office, my beautiful constituency of Eastbourne has held the record for sunshine hours recorded in a month since 1911. Arguably, we should be leading the nation in harnessing solar power. To your earlier point, or to his earlier point, we don't have land readily available locally, but we do have, courtesy of 3 commercial and retail parks, acres of rooftops. Can I ask my right honourable friend what work he is doing, and with other departments, to promote feasibility studies to identify untapped potential for solar generation and to promote financial incentives so local businesses in my town can play their part in tackling climate change?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raised a very important point, and she does indeed have a very beautiful constituency, well worth a visit. She makes a vital point about rooftop solar, and she will know through the energy security strategy that our plan for rooftop solar is to radically simplify planning processes with a consultation on relevant permitted development rights to help support deployment of rooftop solar on commercial premises. And I said we'll also consider the best way to make use of public sector roofs.
David Simmons.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apologies for the misunderstanding. Local energy companies are often well placed to support small and medium-sized enterprises with the transition to net zero, and local authorities, with their insight into the opportunities for things like solar locally, are best placed to help with that. What assessment has the President made of the opportunities that this model may afford?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight the role of local energy companies in helping that transition to net zero through the provision of renewable energy. And as an example, I mean, close to my own constituency, we have Reading Hydro. It's a community-financed, built and operated hydro plant, and it's supplying renewable electricity to local business. And of course, I'd be very happy to meet with him, as would the Energy Minister, to discuss this matter further.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the truth that what business has learnt about this government is that it is entirely inconsistent in what it says today compared to what it says tomorrow? And the example of the Minister talking about solar, when only a few years ago the government were cutting feed-in tariffs, which decimated the industry. Isn't what we really need, and isn't what business needs, to know that they have a government with a strategic plan like the Green New Deal that the Labour Party has been talking about, that they can actually make long-term investments, and know the government's going to say tomorrow what it says today?
Mr. Speaker, could I just remind the honourable gentleman that we have published a net zero strategy which clearly sets out our long-term plans to create hundreds of thousands of extra jobs, green jobs, get many billions of pounds of private investment in. And I just say to him, one of the reasons that we are not reliant on Russian hydrocarbons is because over the last 10 years we have built the second biggest offshore wind sector in the world, and we want to quintuple the size of that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The only net zero that really matters is the one for planet Earth as a whole. So would he agree with me that there is a real potential that we could shoot ourselves in the foot when it comes to energy-intensive industries in this country? I'm thinking about croppers, paper manufacturer in my constituency who make the paper for the poppies, for Hansard paper, but also paper with medical and military applications. If we tax them too much, if we allow their bills to be so high that they go out of business, all we'll do is export their carbon emissions to other countries. So will he talk to his friend, the Energy Secretary, so we have help for our energy-intensive industries to be able to support us in the long run?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he will know the government is providing support to energy-intensive industries to help them decarbonise. And he will also know through the COP26 process we have the Breakthroughs Agenda, where we are working globally on seeing how we can decarbonise some of the most difficult sectors as well. And so there is a global plan as well as a domestic plan on this.
Trees and villages.
Will the President work with the agriculture sector in pursuing his COP goals? Because we have some of the most sustainable farming practices in use anywhere in the world, and many farmers and growers who want to go further in playing their part in protecting nature and safeguarding the climate.
Quite right.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, that my right honourable friend has raised an important point, and the Secretary of State for DEFRA and his ministers are, of course, working on this. But again, at an international level, we are looking to start an agriculture breakthrough as well, so that we can have a global focus on this issue.
SNP spokesperson Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Facebook promoted ads which contained outright climate falsehoods and scepticism during COP26, and it's reported fossil fuel companies and lobbying groups spent an estimated $574,000 on Facebook ads during the summit, resulting in more than 22 million impressions, many of these directly aimed at undermining efforts to achieve climate progress. Would the President agree the best way such businesses could help in the fight against climate change is to put the planet before their profits and come down hard on the climate naysayers? And can he tell us what actions he's been taking to address this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, one thing I would say to you is that we saw at COP26 the business community for, I think, probably the first time at a COP coming together in force and making commitments to tackle climate change. They, of course, now need to deliver on those. On the Pacific issue that she raises, happily write to her separately.
Steve Bryan.
Question number 3, please, sir.
President.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 3 and 12 together. Countries made significant commitments at COP26 on emissions reductions, on finance to support developing nations, on adaptation, loss and damage. We are continuing to press countries to deliver on their promises, and together with the COP27 presidency, Egypt, I'll be co-chairing a meeting of a representative group of ministers from around the world next month, hosted by the Danish government, to take stock of progress on delivery of the Glasgow Climate Pact.
Steve Bryan.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for coming to Winchester early this month to my Ask the Minister session, which was attended by hundreds of my constituents and school children from many schools across the patch, including Peter Symonds College, and for answering their questions so elegantly and openly. I'm sure he would agree that the young people that were there from those schools were so positive and care so much and are searching questions as they should, but are also very optimistic about this presidency and about this whole agenda. What more can we do to empower them, to make them really be able to push forward this agenda during our presidency year?
Mr. Speaker, I very much enjoyed my visit to Winchester, and may I commend my honourable friend for all the work he does in his local community. And of course, we had some excellent questions from the very many young people who were at the event, and they were positive as well in their outlook. I would just point out to him that in the planning for COP26 and in the country visits that I continue to make, listening to the views of young people has been absolutely invaluable, and indeed it's why in the Glasgow Climate Pact we have urged countries to actively involve young people in climate change processes.
Scott Benson.
Question number 12, Mr. As the Minister knows, the UK accounts for only 1% of global CO2 emissions, yet the steps we are taking to combat climate change will cost businesses and the government untold billions. Does the Minister agree that whilst the UK does what is perceived to be the right thing, it is highly likely that other nations will miss climate targets and that the enormous expense and impact upon our own economic competitiveness will all be in vain?
Mr. Speaker, tackling climate change is the right thing to do. It's also economically the smart thing to do. It's why at COP26 we had $130 trillion of private sector money signed up to net zero. It's why as a presidency we've managed to persuade 90% of the global GDP to sign up to net zero. It's why our net zero strategy talks about many hundreds of thousands of jobs and billions of pounds of inward investments. He talks about costs. I just say to my honourable friend, look at what the OBR estimates as the unmitigated cost of climate change, almost 300% debt to GDP by the end of the century. And I know he's a fiscally responsible Conservative as I am, and he would not want to burden future generations with this level of debt.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will, of course, know that one of the reasons why Britain's emissions are so low now is because we've exported most of our filthy, polluting manufacturing industries to poorer nations of the world. So those countries have been polluted in order to provide for our lifestyle. But it's almost 9 years now since world leaders agreed to establish a climate change impacts loss and damage mechanism. Last year, the Scottish Government led the world in committing millions of pounds to that mechanism. When does the United Kingdom Government intend to follow Scotland's lead?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman will know, that at COP26 we agreed the Glasgow Dialogue on Loss and Damage. First time we had significant text in the cover decision on this issue. That work is going forward, as is work on the operationalisation of the Santiago network.
Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, of course, as we urgently seek to combat climate change, it's vital that we do so in a just and fair way, particularly for communities in the north east of Scotland. So bearing that in mind, does he agree with me that his government should do three things? Firstly, fund the Acorn carbon capture underground storage project. Secondly, match fund the Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition Fund. And thirdly, finally, eventually, reform the Tenuos grid charging scandal that is happening at this moment in time.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman has eloquently raised a number of domestic policy issues, and I know that the Energy Minister would be happy to write to him on all of them.
Shadow President Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the recent IPCC climate assessment was deeply worrying. It says current global policies would lead to warming of over 3 degrees, but it offered hope in the dramatic fall in the price of renewables, which means it's now the right choice for cheap energy and to tackle the climate crisis. Given onshore wind is the cheapest, cleanest, quickest power to deliver and is also supported by large majorities of the public in the UK, can the President explain why the government persists, including in its recent strategy, with planning policies that effectively block onshore wind in England?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I certainly agree that we need to be doing more in terms of renewables, and that's what the energy security strategy is all about. We already have 14 gigawatts deployed across the country. There is another 5.8 which is consented in the pipeline. And with regard to future developments, what we have said is that we want to work in partnership with supportive communities to host these new onshore wind farms, and in return they will enjoy the benefits such as local energy discounts.
He knows, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister caved in to those who said they wanted to block onshore wind, and I think the Energy Minister knows it too. Let's try him on another. To tackle the cost of living crisis and the climate emergency, energy efficiency measures are a no-brainer. But the Chancellor steadfastly refused to offer a penny more for energy efficiency in the recent strategy, meaning higher bills for people and more people in fuel poverty. Now, the President is responsible for holding departments to account for net zero. Isn't it time, Mr. Speaker, for him to wield some presidential power, knock heads together and sort this problem out?
Mr. Speaker, the issue of cost of living obviously is facing very many families across the country in all of our constituencies, and that's why the government has put forward over £9 billion worth of support on the cost of living issue. With relation specifically to energy efficiency, he knows that we're investing over £6.6 billion over this Parliament to improve energy efficiency and decarbonise heat, and of course that will lead to lower bills, particularly for those most in need.
Duncan Baker.
Question number 4, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Forest Declaration is an unprecedented commitment from 141 countries, covering 90% of global forests, to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. It's underpinned by $16 billion of public and private finance, by sustainable trade and by support for Indigenous people's rights. And we're working very closely with endorsers to implement it.
Baker.
Can I thank the Minister for recently visiting my constituency? She will know that North Norfolk is blanketed with ancient forests and woodlands, and it's therefore very encouraging to know that woodland coverage is increasing across the UK and that this government is committed to preventing forest loss. Could the Minister update us on in the House on what progress she's making to increase woodland wildlife levels as well?
I thank him for that, and it was a pleasure to visit his wonderful constituency and great as ever to hear about his precious ancient woodland in North Norfolk. We're acting on increasing wildlife in woodland in many ways. Through the environment, government has committed to halt species abundance decline by 2030, and we're using the Nature for Climate Fund to accelerate tree planting that improves biodiversity, and we're increasing funding to bring woodlands into active management, which is fundamental to enhancing and conserving wildlife.
Anna McMorran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that deforestation is causing huge issues for Indigenous people across the world. What more can the government be putting pressure on these governments worldwide, particularly Brazil, to prevent this deforestation from companies who are operating here in the UK?
Minister.
I thank her for that. She raises a vital point that we're fully aware of. That's why 140 countries signed that commitment to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation at Glasgow. But also this government has itself brought through a due diligence clause in the Environment Act, so we're making our businesses look at sustainability of their forest products. So we're leading by example, but we've got a great deal more to do to work around the globe to stop deforestation.
We now come to topicals, Dr. James Davies.
Topical question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
President.
Mr. Speaker, the IPCC's latest report, published this month, makes clear that the window to limit average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees is closing alarmingly fast. We need to make faster progress, and so the UK is continuing to urge all governments, but particularly the G20, to honour the promises made in the Glasgow Climate Pact. We're also working to get finance flowing to climate action, and last month I co-chaired a meeting of G7 ministers, multilateral development banks and the private sector on expanding just energy transition partnerships to support developing nations, and I will today travel to the World Bank spring meetings to drive this work forward.
Sir James Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that rising international gas prices do not push back up the use of coal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, at COP26, all countries agreed to phase down the use of coal domestically, and will continue to urge them to deliver on this commitment. I have to say that as a result of the current energy security and pricing issues, I do believe we will see an acceleration of renewables and clean energy capacity globally.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To keep the hope of 1.5 alive, 28 billion tonnes of emissions need to be taken out by 2030. What steps is he taking to advance Green New Deals like the Bio-Yorkshire project so they can get on and bring that new technology forward?
President.
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Lady will know, the Government is providing a significant amount of investment in new technologies, and as I've just referenced in response to an earlier question, the CFD auction process is one very good way of doing that.
Michael Loveday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brazil announced strong environmental commitments at COP26 that exceeded expectations. My own visit to Brazil after COP26 reconfirmed that Brazil is experiencing an economy-wide shift towards lower carbon emissions. Will the President provide this House with his own observations following his own recent visit, and will he agree that Brazil also has much to offer the rest of the world in terms of renewable energy, especially where ethanol-based technologies are concerned?
Mr. Speaker, may I commend my honourable friend for his work as the UK's trade envoy to Brazil. He's doing a brilliant job. During my recent visit, I encouraged the government to formally submit its 2030 emission reduction targets of 50% to the UNFCCC. It's done that now, and we also discussed Brazil's plan for a significant expansion of renewables, and I offered to share the UK's experience on expanding our own offshore wind sector.
Morris.
This month, a set of floating wind projects under Carillion Winds, worth a potential $10 billion, was announced, alongside a memorandum of understanding with wind turbine manufacturer Lamprell Unfortunately, most of the fabrication work for these projects seems to be destined to be carried out in the United Arab Emirates. Does the Minister agree with me, the GMB union and other manufacturing unions, that we must do better to build back better, greener and provide UK-based manufacturing jobs?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for that question. And of course, floating offshore wind is a key part of the energy security strategy announced by the Prime Minister last week, with a 5-gigawatt target ambition by 2030. In terms of securing and improving the UK supply chain, floating offshore wind is still a relatively nascent technology, but I will make sure that I take the point he raises to the supply chain task force.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Foreign Secretary writes her international development strategy, what conversations is the President having about the importance of international climate finance for the very poorest countries in the world?
President.
Mr. Speaker, as she raised a very important point, of course we need to make sure we honour the $100 billion pledge, but as I said earlier, we're also ensuring that we work with countries to ensure they have funding for energy, clean energy transition, and as I said, I'm off to the World Bank meetings shortly to take that work forward.
Florence Session-Lomi. Florence, double 5.
Sorry.
Question.
Number 5.
Question. Stop it. We'll move on. Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that in order to achieve net zero by 2050, we need to transition from North Sea oil and gas? But very importantly, this is a transition and not an extinction, as many parties opposite are calling for.
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. It is vital that we have a North Sea transition. That is the purpose of the government's North Sea transition deal. That is what we are delivering on with the sector. Some parties opposite want to see an extinction. That would not be in the nation's interest and would only lead to a rise in imported hydrocarbons, which is also not in our interest at this time.
British Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, does the Minister realise he's guilty of being too nice? We don't even just need where's the plan, Stan? We need where's the money, honey? Why doesn't he get in number 11, shake the Chancellor of the Exchequer till his teeth rattle, and get the money that he should be putting into environmental concerns and saving our planet?
Mr. Speaker, I just say to the honourable gentleman that since March 2021 and through the 2021 budget and spending review, the government has committed a total of £30 billion of domestic investment for the green industrial revolution. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, but we are ensuring that many tens of billions of pounds of private investment also flows into green transition.
Philip Dunn.
Is extraction of fossil fuels from new oil and gas fields consistent with meeting our climate change commitments during the transition?
Mr. Speaker, as I've said, what we want to see is a managed transition, and that is not going to happen overnight. He will also know that we've set out in our domestic energy security strategy that future licensing rounds will have to be compatible with the climate compatibility checkpoint, which will be set out shortly.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to point out that a British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on Parliament Live TV. We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. Dr. Neil Hudson.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I know the whole House will want to join me in wishing Her Majesty the Queen a very happy birthday for tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today. I will then be travelling to India to deepen the strategic trade, defence and people-to-people ties between our two countries, building on India's involvement in the Carbis Bay G7 summit. I'll be seeing Prime Minister Modi in Delhi, meeting Indian business people investing in the UK and visiting British investments in India.
Dr. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Challenges with rural transport remain some of the greatest obstacles facing people in Penrith and the border, and I was pleased last year to see, on top of the government's £3 billion national bus strategy helping areas like Cumbria, that Cumbria County Council received an additional £1.5 million to enhance provision as part of the Rural Mobility Fund. But I'm sure my right honourable friend can only imagine my disappointment this month when Cumbria was allocated no funding from the latest tranche of bus funding. Can the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that Cumbria can look forward to future funding schemes to improve our vital rural bus services?
Prime Minister.
Okay, Mike, I thank my honourable friend. He is a great champion for rural Cumbria and for bus services, and he's right that Cumbria got another £1.5 million. We do for buses. We do want to put more into buses. I believe in them passionately myself, and I will make sure that he has a meeting with the relevant minister.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in wishing Her Majesty a happy birthday? Why did the Prime Minister's Press Secretary, Allegra Stratton, have to resign from her job?
Minister.
Sorry. I bitterly regret Allegra's resignation. I think it was very sad, and I think she did an outstanding job. But I do, particularly since she was the one who coined the expression coal, cars, cash and trees, which enabled the UK to deliver a fantastic COP26 summit last year.
Keir Starmer.
Allegra Strachan laughed at breaking the rules. She resigned. The Prime Minister then claimed he was furious at her behaviour and accepted her resignation. Professor Neil Ferguson broke the rules. He also resigned. The Prime Minister said that was the right thing to do. The former Health Secretary broke the rules. He too resigned. The Prime Minister tried to claim he sacked him. Why does the Prime Minister think everybody else's actions have consequences except his own?
I thank the right honourable gentleman. I feel he's in some kind of Doctor Who time warp. We had this conversation yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and I've explained why I bitterly regret receiving an FPN. I apologise to the House, but he asks about the actions for which I take responsibility, and I'll tell him we're going to get on with delivering for the British people, making sure that we power out of the problems that COVID has left us, and more people in work than there were before the pandemic, Mr. Speaker, fixing our energy problems and leading the world in standing up to the aggression of Vladimir Putin. Those are all subjects about which I think he could reasonably ask questions now.
These are strange answers from a man who yesterday claimed to be making a humble apology. Does the Prime Minister actually accept that he broke the law?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I've been absolutely clear that I humbly accept what the police have said. I've paid the fixed penalty notice. And, Mr. Speaker, what I think the country and what I think the whole House would really rather do is get on with the things for which we were elected, deliver on our promises to the British people. And you could not have clearer evidence of the intellectual bankruptcy of Labour. They have no plans. They have no plans for energy. They have no plans for social care, and they have no plans, Mr. Speaker, to fix the economy.
Prime Minister, sit down. I want to hear what you've got to say, but I can't hear when you're talking that way. I'm here in the chair. Please, if you can help me. No, I think we'll have had enough.
The state of it, the party of Peel and Churchill reduced to shouting and screaming in defence of this lawbreaker.
Now then, that's the last time that Peroni that you just asked about, you might have to go and take it. I don't hear any more, or else you will be drinking. Keir Starmer.
So, Mr. Speaker, yesterday's apology lasted for as long as the Prime Minister thought necessary to be clipped for the news. But once the cameras were off, Once the cameras were off, the Prime Minister went to see his backbenchers, and he was back to blaming everyone else. He even said that the Archbishop of Canterbury had not been critical enough of Putin. In fact, the Archbishop called Putin's war an act of great evil, and the Church of England has led the way in providing refuge to those fleeing. Would the Prime Minister like to take this opportunity to apologise for slandering the Archbishop and the Church of England?
Mr. Speaker, I think the right honourable gentleman. I was slightly taken aback to be Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I was slightly taken aback for the government to be criticised over the policy that we have devised to end the deaths at sea in the Channel as a result of cruel criminal gangs. I was surprised that we were attacked for that. And actually, Mr. Speaker, it turns out that that policy, do you know who proposed that policy, first of all, in 2004? It was David Blunkett, Mr. Speaker, who said it was a 21st, yes it was, and she'll remember, a 21st century solution to the problems of illegal asylum seeking and immigration. He should stick with, he's a Corbynister in a smart Islington suit. That's the truth.
I think you'll find Mr. Corbyn doesn't have the whip. But I think that's a no then. Pathetic. He never takes responsibility for his words or action. They were all there. The Prime Minister also accused the BBC of not being critical enough of Putin. Would the Prime Minister have the guts to say that to the face of Clive Myrie, Lise Doucet and Steve Rosenberg, who have all risked their lives day in, day out on the front line in Russia and Ukraine, uncovering Putin's barbarism?
If the right honourable gentleman wants to join the Conservative Party and come and listen to the meetings of the Conservative Party, he's welcome to do it. But as I say, I think he's a Corbynister in an Islington suit. But I said nothing of the kind, and I have the highest admiration as a journalist and a former journalist for what journalists do. I think they do an outstanding. I mean, I think he should withdraw what he just said. It has absolutely no basis or foundation in truth.
Keir Starmer.
That's how he operates. A merely mouthed apology when the cameras roll. A vicious attack on those who tell the truth as soon as the cameras are off. Slander decent people in a private room. Let the slander spread without the backbone to repeat it in public. How can the Prime Minister claim to be a patriot when he deliberately attacks and degrades the institutions of our great country?
Prime Minister, how many does he have? Mr. Speaker, sorry, Mr. Speaker.
No, premise, just a second. I want to hear the Prime Minister's answers. I expect it both ways. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is an indication of the depths to which he's willing to sink. That he accuses me of producing journalists. What he says is completely without any foundation whatever. I did not attack the BBC last night. For their coverage of Ukraine, he must be out of his tiny mind, Mr. Speaker. He must be out of his tiny mind. I said no such thing, and there are people behind who will testify to that. He is completely wrong, Mr. Speaker. That is the limit. That is the limit of his willingness to ask sensible questions today. We are getting on. This government is getting on with the serious problems that require attention. Fixing our energy supply issues, and by the way, undoing the damage of the Labour government that didn't invest in nuclear power for 13 years. We're the nuclear power station every year. Standing up to Putin, Mr. Speaker, when he would have elected a Putin apologist. That's what he wanted to do, and he campaigned to do that. Mr. Speaker, and fixing our economy with record numbers of people now in work, productivity back above what it was, more than 500,000 people back on the payroll than there were before the pandemic began, Mr. Speaker. That is as a result of the decisions, the tough calls this government has made. We get on with the job while they flip-flop around like beached flounders on the beach, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Founded in Hitchin by an inspirational man called Richard Lucas, the GoVox mental well-being platform was started in 2018 following the sad loss of some local young men to suicide. Since then, working with brilliant partners like NHSX, King's College London and others, the technology platform and support services have grown to support the mental well-being and mental health of over 40,000 young people in over 10 countries. Today, GoVox is launching its campaign to offer its services free to over 1,000 state secondary schools. Would the Prime Minister welcome this initiative, perhaps go to Hitchin and meet the people from GoVox? And secondly, could he set out what more we can do to help young people and young men with the problems of mental health and mental well-being?
Prime Minister.
Yeah. I thank him very much. I thank my honourable friend. I'm very pleased to hear about the work that GoVox is doing to support mental health and well-being, and we're putting more money into mental health care support, an extra £2.3 billion a year in the next financial year, which of course we can supply thanks to the decisions taken by this government, which actually that party opposed.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition in wishing Her Majesty the Queen best wishes for her birthday tomorrow? Mr. Speaker, last night the Prime Minister might have convinced his backbenchers and his spineless Scottish Tories to keep him in place for another few weeks. But the public aren't so easily fooled. 82% of people in Scotland said they believe the Prime Minister lied to this Parliament and to the public about his law-breaking COVID parties. Are they right? Or should they not believe their lying eyes?
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman. We had a long conversation about this yesterday. I understand the point of his question, but we are going to get on with the job of delivering for the people of the whole of the United Kingdom.
If the Prime Minister wants to get on, he should be offering his resignation to the Queen before her birthday. Mr. Speaker, no government can be led by a Prime Minister who's in a constant state of crisis to save his own skin. And what's worse, the UK government is now led by a tag team of scandal, a Prime Minister who can't be trusted with the truth, and a Chancellor who can't be trusted with his taxes. Everyone knows that this Prime Minister is now on borrowed time until the Tory backbenchers count the cost of their council election defeat. But in the meantime, families are counting the cost of a Tory-made cost of living crisis every day. After yesterday's farce, isn't it finally the time for him to accept that neither his party or the public can afford to keep him around as Prime Minister for 1 minute longer?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if that were true, then I don't think he'd be calling for my resignation. What we're going to do is get on with the job in hand, and that is deliver for the entire people of this country. And by the way, Mr. Speaker, he hasn't answered the point I made yesterday, which is I think is still incredible, that at a time when we need to stand up to aggression from Vladimir Putin, it is still the policy of the Scottish Nationalist Party to get rid of this country's unilateral defence.
We have a closed question, Philip Holloway.
For three, sir.
I thank my honourable friend. He's an excellent champion for Kettering, and we're fully committed to the delivery of the new hospital for Kettering. The release of funding will be subject to the usual business case assessment process.
The redevelopment of Kettering General Hospital is the #1 local priority for residents in Kettering and across Northamptonshire. Would my right honourable friend be kind enough, please, to facilitate a meeting with the Health Secretary for the 3 members for Kettering, Wellingborough, Corby, together with the Hospital Chief Executive, so that we can trigger the start of the drawdown of the initial £46 million worth of funding?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, told me that he's met them before and he's happy to meet them again.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Yfarydd. Plaid Cymru have been calling for 15 years for a law to ban politicians from being willfully misleading. New polling by Compassion in Politics shows that 73% of people support such a law. Will the Prime Minister support a lying in politics bill?
Mr. Speaker, it is well known that the rules of this House demand that we tell the truth in this House, and that's what we all try to do.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. PMQs for a constituency MP like me is a wonderful opportunity to ask the Prime Minister for a new hospital for Doncaster, maybe. Or maybe for Doncaster to be the home of Great British Rail headquarters. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, there is a more pressing issue, and that is that men are dying so much younger than they should. So will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss the merits of having a Minister for Men and the benefits of a men's health strategy? That way, the next time I am fortunate enough to get a PMQ, I can lobby the Prime Minister for a new hospital for Doncaster and for Doncaster to be the home of Great British Rail headquarters.
Prime Minister.
I thank my friend, honourable friend, very much for his work in this area. And we are determined to tackle all the health conditions that he's describes and cares about, particularly mental health and suicide prevention. And I note his plea for a new hospital. I know it's one that's shared by many colleagues on these benches. This is the government that is funding that, making it possible, thanks to the decisions we've taken, allowing our economy to grow, which would not have been possible if we'd listened to them, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On this side, not only do we believe that lawbreakers can't be lawmakers, but also that tax raisers should be taxpayers. And when people in powerful positions pick and choose where they pay their taxes, that's an insult to everyone else who doesn't have that luxury. So can I ask the Prime Minister, how many members of his cabinet have ever been involved in a tax avoidance scheme?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what we try to do in this government is cut taxes for the whole country, and I'm proud to say that what the Chancellor did in the recent spring statement by lifting the threshold for national insurance contributions was to have a tax cut for about £330 for most people in this country. That's a fantastic thing.
Sarah Atherton.
Mr. Speaker, if you live in North Wales and want to watch international sport, you have to travel 4 hours to Cardiff or Swansea.
Shocking.
The Wrexham Racecourse, with its historic cop stand, is home to Wembley-bound Wrexham Football Club. It's the oldest international stadium in the world and forms part of our Levelling Up Fund bid. Would the Prime Minister agree that round 2 of the Levelling Up Fund offers an excellent opportunity to level up access to sport?
Well, there could be no better campaigner for Wrexham and for the interests of Wrexham sport. I will do what I can, Mr. Speaker, but she'll know that 121 million from the first round of the Levelling Up Fund was awarded to Wales, and I'm sure that Wrexham has every chance of success in the future.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has been asked about sodium valproate scandal previously, but Sean Linton at the Sunday Times this weekend revealed that campaigners were blacklisted, including my constituent Emma Murphy, who is here in the gallery today. Advice from the Cumberledge report has been ignored, warnings are still not on medication as of a couple of weeks ago, and a redress scheme is still not forthcoming. Will the Prime Minister meet with me and campaigners like Emma to discuss what can be done to right this incredible wrong?
Prime Prime Minister.
I thank you very much for raising the point. I understand that we've had a review already of the issue, but I'll make sure that he has a proper meeting, or he and the campaigners that he mentions have a proper meeting with the relevant minister in the Health Department.
Yeah. Robert Jenry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Aidan Aslin has served in the Ukrainian Armed Forces for 4 years. Last week, he was captured by the Russian army in Mariupol. Yesterday, a video emerged of my constituent handcuffed, physically injured, and being interviewed under duress for propaganda purposes. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that this is a flagrant breach of the Geneva Convention, that treating any prisoner of war in this manner is illegal, and that the interviewer, Graham Phillips, is in danger of prosecution for war crimes, and that any online platform, such as YouTube, which hosts propaganda videos of this kind, should take them down immediately?
I thank my right honourable friend very much, and I think everybody will want to will urge the Russian state to treat his constituent humanely and compassionately, because in my view, although we do not encourage people, in fact we actively dissuade people from going to that theatre of conflict, I understand that he'd been serving in the Ukrainian forces for some time, and his situation was very different from that of a mercenary, Mr. Speaker. I hope that he is treated with care and compassion. I thoroughly echo the sentiments that my right honourable friend has expressed about those who broadcast propaganda messages.
James Murray.
Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government is raising taxes on working people in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So can I press the Prime Minister on whether he agrees that it would add insult to injury if his Chancellor or any other government ministers were to benefit from overseas tax havens in their personal tax affairs?
Mr. Speaker. Good point, Mr. Speaker, but we are responsible for cutting taxes for everybody, which is what we're actually doing.
Well,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Newcastle-under-Lyme is receiving over £50 million of government investment into our High Street and the High Street in Kidsgrove, in my honourable friend's neighbouring constituency. But it's all being overshadowed by the ongoing environmental disaster at Wally's Quarry. In January, the operator was hit by 3 Category 1 breaches by the Environment Agency. My constituents are utterly sick of it. It's been going on for far too long, Prime Minister. We need to see tougher enforcement. We need to see the permit taken away. What hope can he give my constituents? How can we stop the stink?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend has raised this issue before. I know how infuriating it is for his constituents. That's why my right honourable friend, the Environment Secretary, has now ordered action against the site operator, and permanent capping will begin on site next month. I can tell him that will improve things for thousands of residents in his constituency, and if it is necessary to take further action to remove these malodorous vapours, Mr. Speaker, then we will.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With details of the Sougray report trickling out, a flood of photos of Partygate yet to be released, and any number of fixed penalty notices liable to be leaked, this is a Prime Minister that's not fit to run a bath, never mind this. It's time for him to stop this ridiculous charade that he believes no rules were broken. So will he commit to making public every fixed penalty notice he receives? Will he publish the party photos taken by the official photographer and ensure Sougray's report is published at the earliest opportunity? We have a right to know the truth.
Well, Mr. Speaker, on the my own fixed penalty notices, I've been transparent with the House. I apologise. On the rest of it, and will be, Mr. Speaker. But on the rest of it, I really think, as I've said before, that the House should wait to the conclusion of the investigation when Sougray will be finally reporting.
Sir John Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Long ago, in a far-off place, thousands of British servicemen sailed into what for them was the unknown as they witnessed the early tests of nuclear weapons. They've lived with the consequence of the service to our nation ever since. Following a PMQ from the Honourable Member for Salford, the Prime Minister has agreed to meet me and her and those veterans. But will he now assure the House that he will take personal charge of the decision on whether to grant the remaining servicemen while there are few left, the service medal they so richly deserve.
Prime Minister.
I thank him very much. I thank my right honourable friend very much. I thank him for campaigning on this issue, which I know attracts support across the House, and I certainly will take personal charge of the matter myself and make sure that they receive the recognition they deserve.
Liz Twist.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents across Bladen knew the rules and stuck to the rules. Nurses and teachers included. No after-work drinks for them. The Prime Minister set these rules. Night after night, he was on national TV to exhort us to stick to the rules for everyone's sake. Yet he continues to say that he doesn't think he broke any rules. My constituents are angry that while they stuck to the law, the Prime Minister broke it. Trust in his government is broken. So when will he go?
Mr. Speaker, I understand the feelings of her constituents, and I continue to express my apologies for the FPN that I received. But what the government is going to do is get on with tackling the issues that face this country and delivering for the British people, and that is my priority.
Robert Butlin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my constituents, like many others across our country, has been helping directly with the humanitarian effort in Ukraine and the region, and he received a most troubling message from a resident of the city of Kherson only days ago, and I quote from part of it. "There are no green corridors for evacuation. People are trying to flee the city at their own risk under fire. The Russians are living in our homes. They are plotting terror, robbing, harassing, kidnapping and killing our people, doing whatever they want." Mr. Speaker, what more can my right honourable friend and the international community do to ensure that Putin and those who do his bidding are brought to justice for their crimes?
Prime Minister.
Well, I think that my right honourable friend, is making an incredibly important point, because the savagery that the Russians are now unleashing on Ukraine clearly knows no limits and is clearly authorised from the very top. And she asked what more we can do. I think what we need to do is make it clear to serving officers now in the Russian forces that they will, if we can proceed with the international criminal prosecutions that we want to see, they will eventually face justice in the way that those who participated in massacres in Bosnia faced justice in the past. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that will have a chilling effect on their current appalling conduct.
Nick Smith.
Mr. Speaker, every week examples emerge of government waste during COVID. And last year, the former Health Secretary told me that there'd be no profiteering and no cronyism. Does the Prime Minister still agree with him?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think that a lot of people made money, I'm sad to say, out of COVID in a way that perhaps they shouldn't have done. And we deplore that, and we are trying to recoup as much as we possibly can. But I would just remind him of the constant clamour from those benches and around the country for us to equip our country with PPE, with medicines as fast as possible. And that we did, Mr. Speaker.
Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister join me in thanking the brilliant staff and volunteers at Watford General Hospital for their tireless work for our community over many years? And would he agree with me that we should get started as soon as possible on the ambitious plans put forward by West Herts Hospital Trust as part of the new hospital programme to transform healthcare across our whole community so staff and patients can access world-class health services in facilities fit for the 21st century? And, Mr. Speaker, if I may add, the ambitious plans are truly shovel-ready. I will gladly go and buy a shovel today to get started.
Mr. Speaker, he is a fantastic champion for Watford, and he's been. I know that because I've been to see him several times. He's been campaigning on this issue to get a hospital in Watford ever since he was triumphantly elected, and he's going to be successful because there will be a new hospital scheme in his local area, and it's part of our plan to deliver 48 new hospitals in this country by 2030, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister's fundamental political problem at the moment isn't about parties or fixed penalty notices or cake. It's about the lack of trust, integrity and credibility at the heart of government, which he himself now personifies. Mr Speaker, when is the Prime Minister going to realise that people don't want to hear any more glib, half-hearted non-apologies or hear him witter on about getting on with the job? They just want this Pinocchio Prime Minister to pack his bags and go.
Mr Speaker, I think when are the Scottish people going to hear any... sorry, Mr Speaker, when are the Scottish people going to hear an ounce of sense from the Scottish Nationals?
Prime Minister, we both can't stand up at the same time. I'm trying to be helpful. We've got to be more moderate in taunting language use. Pinocchio is not acceptable. I'm sure the member wishes to withdraw it quickly.
Mr Speaker, I withdraw that, but he packs his bags and goes.
Minister.
It's not a withdrawal.
Withdrawn it. Sorry, you've withdrawn it. You with it. Let's get on. Prime Minister. Withdraw. Is that are you answering anything?
Sorry, I don't know what his question is, Mr. Speaker. He's withdrawn it, but the answer is that we're going to get on the job. Get on with it. It'll be nice to hear an ounce of sense from the Scottish Nationalist Party or some competent government.
Rhys Villiers.
The London Borough of Barnes is surrounded by Labour councils, all of which have higher council tax and have abandoned weekly bin collections. So will the Prime Minister urge everyone to come out on the 5th of May and vote Conservative in order to keep council tax lower than Labour and to protect our weekly bin collection?
Quite right, Mr. Speaker. Conservative councils fix 4 times more potholes, recycle twice as much, and Conservative councils, Mr. Speaker, charge less.
Tom Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, the Ministerial Code states that ministers have a duty to comply with the law and to protect the integrity of public life. The Prime Minister has broken the law and repeatedly shown contempt for the British public. Conservative MPs opposite seem content to decry the principles of honesty and integrity as they unashamedly defend him. The public want him gone, we want him gone. When will he do the right thing and resign?
Mr. Speaker, I know why they want me gone, because this government is going to get on. We are going to get on and show why this Conservative government is going to deliver for the British people, fixing our cost of living issues, making sure that we solve our long-term energy problems, and delivering on everything that we promised to do, Mr. Speaker. And they have absolutely no plan. That's the difference.
David Evan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On these benches, we were elected to make the most of our Brexit freedoms, including they don't like it, Mr. Speaker, they don't like it, but including tackling immigration, illegal immigration, securing our borders and crack down on the evil people smuggling trade. Does my right honourable friend agree that our groundbreaking partnership with Rwanda will do just that?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it is a part of the solution. And it's something that, as I said just now, was advocated in 2004 by the then Home Secretary David Blunkett, a Blairite Home Secretary. It's now attacked in the most ludicrous terms by the current Labour opposition, who are obviously, as I just said, Corbynistas in Islington suits.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wondered what the Prime Minister makes of this quote. When a regime has been in power too long, when it has fatally exhausted the patience of the people, and when oblivion finally beckons, across the world, you can rely on leaders of that regime to act solely in the interests of self-preservation and not in the interests of the electorate. His words, Mr. Speaker, Daily Telegraph, 28th of February 2011. Does he still agree? Yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, all I can say is that I'm delighted that she's a reader of the Daily Telegraph. I think what she needs to do is keep going to the end of the article. That's my advice to her.
We now come to the 10-minute rule bill.
Barry Shearman points.
Let's just let the room clear. Just. And sit down a minute, Tim.
Your office got to me very quickly. I don't know how they fell down.
Because I sent the message.
Yeah,
Thank you. Brilliant.
Send them the numbers.
The antenna going up. Right, I've got a point of order. We'll start with Sir David Evanet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On these benches, on these benches, we strongly believe in the BBC and believe that it does a great job, especially on reporting from the Ukraine. The suggestion from the Leader of the Opposition that the Prime Minister suggested somewhat differently in last night's meeting, which I attended, is absolutely inaccurate. And the Leader of the Opposition to retract that because he's misled the House.
I wasn't there. It would be impossible to comment on something I didn't know. Yes, but I think it's more for my judgment, and I don't know. But I'll certainly look into the matter, and thank you. Point of order, Barry Shearman.
Mr. Speaker, I know that all of us in this House are fair game to the media, and all of us enjoy many of the political commentators and sketch writers. But, Mr. Speaker, this morning's edition of The Times carried a Quentin Letts article which I believe was sexist, misogynistic and totally unacceptable. And the way that he described, not what she said, but what our honourable friend, the member for West Ham, it was about everything about the substance of any speech. It was cruel, it was disgraceful, and I don't know what we can do about it, but Quentin Letts specialises in that misogynistic approach, especially women in this chamber. Is it time that we withdrew his parliamentary press pass?
No, in a nutshell, what I would say is that I do expect, and quite rightfully, as you've raised the matter, it's not a point of order for the Chair. You've certainly put it on the record. What I would say is, I think it is important that it is about tolerance and moderate language. But in fairness, the freedom of the press, and I've taken the hits on some of it as well, and the good honourable member himself was also, what I would say is, I think there is a level, and we all judge that level, and you've judged it to go beyond, and I do accept that, and that's why you've put it on the record, and I think for that purpose we'll leave it there. Who's that? Robert Halfon, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You'll be aware of the incident with the member for Harrow when he was driving through. Can
I just say, I'm well aware of it. I've had a discussion. I've got a meeting coming later. I'd certainly not raise on the floor of the House the issue of security at the moment. I will sooner have that meeting first, and then by all means, if we aren't satisfied, I'll come back. There's some information I don't want to come. I'd sooner leave the security issue because it was a worry and it's a problem, and I'd sooner not air it here until I've met with the three members concerned, more than one. But a general point, I don't want to open up security.
If it's possible, would you look at having a police officer outside the gate as people drive in, not just inside the gate?
Well, once again, I don't want to be brought into a security issue about that. I want to leave it there. I think it's better we do. And please come and see me privately, and we can certainly have a discussion. Right, let us now try and come to the 10-minute rule bill. Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for the succession of female heirs to hereditary titles and for connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, on this day, when we join in wishing Her Majesty a very happy birthday, we can note that we have been blessed to live in a new Elizabethan era, an era in which Her Majesty has long reigned over us, and we celebrate her Platinum Jubilee with true devotion. In 2013, royal assent was given to the Succession to the Crown Act, which means that henceforth it will be the firstborn child of Prince George who will be in the line of succession to succeed him. This act ended male primogeniture for the Crown. But we left undone any wider reform to primogeniture in this United Kingdom. And as a result, Mr. Speaker, we have a situation in this very Parliament where 1/8 of the seats in the other place are reserved for men only. Can you believe that, Mr. Speaker? I will repeat it as I find it so shocking. 1/8 of the seats in the upper house of this Parliament are reserved for men only, through the system of 92 seats reserved for hereditary peers. Now, whatever your views of the other place, or of hereditary peerages more generally, and I know there will be a wide range of views shared here, I hope we can all agree that in the 21st century, this embedded sex discrimination is simply not acceptable. Women are treated unfairly for no other reason than that they are women, and this is unacceptable, indefensible, and has terrible real-world consequences. For example, Mr. Speaker, only 13% of the land in the UK is owned by women. In other words, 87% of the land in the UK is owned by men. Boys are twice as likely as girls to inherit family businesses. And if we can't change inequality at the top of our society, then we will never be able to change inequality for the whole of our society. Put simply, daughters should be treated the same as sons across society. If it's good enough for the succession to the crown, it should be good enough for everyone else. And the hereditary peerages in the other place should go automatically to the eldest child, and at the moment that very rarely happens. As drafted, my bill would not apply immediately when there is a son due to inherit a title. It would certainly not be retrospective. If there's already a son in the line of succession, then this would remain the case. The bill affects 803 hereditary peers, including 24 dukes, 34 marquises, 191 earls, 115 viscounts, 426 barons, and 4 countesses and 9 baronesses in their own right. They could all potentially be one of the 92 hereditary peers, or on the register to stand as a hereditary peer in a by-election to the House of Lords. I understand that the register of peers for the by-elections currently has 210 peers on it, only one of whom is female. As this demonstrates, it is already possible to be a female hereditary peer, but clearly because of the current system, it's not as routine as for males and clearly not as fair. As a Conservative, Mr. Speaker, I stand for equality of opportunity. We want every person born in this country to enjoy the same chance to make a difference, to thrive and to prosper. I cannot rest until this posh glass ceiling is broken. I pay tribute to the member for Shipley, who tried to bring this bill in March 2019. He is a champion of true equality. And I also pay tribute to Charlotte Carupole of Daughters' Rights, who helps to keep this just cause alive in this place. So let's agree today that we will make this small and symbolic change for our country's sake and for the sake of equality between men and women.
Very good. That the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Nikki Aiken, Harriet Harman, Philip Davies, Christine Jardine, Maria Miller, Jess Phillips, Esther McVeigh, Sarah Champion, Tim Lawton, Sir Christopher Chope, and myself, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you can see the vision of the poll.
Harriet Baldwin.
Hereditary Titles Female Succession Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 6th of May.
Friday the 6th of May. Well done, Hans. You've got the best bill that I've seen in years. Well done. Right. Programme to be moved formally. Like to move. The question is, on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Order, order, order. We're in the middle of a vote. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Subsidy Control Bill, consideration of Lord's amendments.
No. Financial privilege is not engaged by any of the Lord's amendments to the Subsidy Control Bill. We will begin with Government motion to agree to Lord's Amendments 1, with which we will consider all Lord's amendments, to Lord's Amendments 13 as listed on the selection paper. I call the Minister to move with Lord's Amendments 1. Minister Paul Scully.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by expressing my appreciation for the shared ambition across this House and indeed both Houses to create a domestic subsidy control regime that will work for people and communities across the United Kingdom. The rigorous debate in both Houses has resulted in the improved bill that we have before us today, and I hope that the government amendments passed by the House of Lords will in turn be accepted by this House. I start with Amendments 13 to 38, 44 to 47 and 51 related to the topic of transparency, a topic that's well championed in this House by my honourable friend, not in this place, but the member for Westminster in particular. Firstly, in place of the higher transparency thresholds which apply to subsidies given under a published scheme and given an MFA or SBEI assistance, we've introduced a single upload threshold of £100,000, which now applies to all subsidies that are subject to the transparency requirements. Of course, there's never been a threshold for regular standalone subsidies, which all need to be published. This represents a substantial 80% reduction from the original threshold of £500,000 for subsidies given under the schemes. Secondly, we've significantly shortened the upload deadlines, reducing this by half for non-tax subsidy awards from 6 months to 3 months, so that subsidies will be visible in the database far sooner. The third change is that we've introduced new obligations to require the upload of certain permitted modifications of a subsidy or scheme to the database. Public authorities will now be subject to the same obligations to upload even minor changes with the same upload deadlines as for the original subsidy. This will ensure that the database continues to provide up-to-date information about subsidies or schemes that are modified after they've been granted. And fourth, we've placed a duty on the Secretary of State to review the transparency databases at such intervals as they consider appropriate, thereby ensuring that there's an additional quality control. Yes, Honourable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for what he's saying. The Minister referred to the fact that there's been thorough discussions in this House, in this place, but also in the other place as well. And I'm just wondering, Minister, whether those thorough discussions have also involved the devolved administrations, in particular Northern Ireland Assembly, but obviously Scottish Parliament and Welsh Assembly as well. And if there is disagreement, how the Minister and Government intend to deal with that disagreement?
Honourable gentleman raises a really good point, and we try to work with all of the devolved administrations right the way through the process from beginning to end, and we've continued conversations with each of them over this period of time. Now, clearly, there will be differences in this process, but this does need to work for the whole of the United Kingdom. So I'm really keen that we continue the dialogue. Whether it's Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, to make sure that we can do as much as we can to reach agreement. Clearly, that's not always going to be possible. That's the nature of dialogue, but we'll continue to do so. Yes, sir.
So ultimately, in that situation, is the Minister not saying that the English government, as represented down here at Westminster in these devolved areas, is actually going to be having the power of veto over the decisions of the Scottish and Welsh and Northern Ireland governments?
UK government, the UK government, however, has the reserved power of subsidy control. So it's the UK government that actually that basically that acts upon that reserved power. But finally, we've introduced an amendment that's specifying that the Secretary of State may provide statutory guidance to public authorities on pre-action information requests. That's the provision of information following a request about a subsidy decision to an interested party that's considering whether to ask the Competition Appeal Tribunal to review the subsidy. But two quick amendments relating to levelling up. Amendment 50 makes clear that addressing local or regional disadvantages is considered to be an equity rationale for the purpose of assessing compliance with Principle A. That puts beyond any doubt that a subsidy to address local or regional disadvantage can be given, provided, of course, that the other principles and requirements of the regime are met. Amendment 9 exempts from the prohibition on relocation those relocation subsidies that have the effect of reducing social or economic disadvantage. The subsidy must, of course, also comply with the principles and other requirements.
Thank you very much for letting me come in again. On the issue of levelling up, because I know the Government and the Minister and the Prime Minister has given a commitment to levelling up across all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I'm always very conscious that perhaps we want to see that actually happening, not just in words. Can the Minister give us some assurance in relation to Northern Ireland, where the cost of living is higher, where wages are lower, and products and consumer goods are higher in price, that we will receive the levelling up in the Northern Ireland region and through the Northern Ireland Assembly that we should be receiving? Thank you.
Thank you, honourable gentleman. And indeed, yes, levelling up does not exclude any one area of the United Kingdom, and it doesn't exclude levelling up within regions as well. I think that's really important. But this solely shapes the framework, provides the framework for that. But then things like the Levelling Up Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, other measures that can use this framework will indeed, I'm sure, benefit his constituency and indeed Northern Ireland as a whole. It's really important that we do get that right. But I'm happy to report also that in addressing the findings of the 17th report of the session by the Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee on the Subsidy Control Bill, we produced amendments 1, 5 to 8, 10 to 12, 39 and 40 that respond to those concerns. The first one addresses a concern with Clause 10. Parliamentary scrutiny of streamlined subsidy schemes made under Clause 10 has been strengthened by giving either House the ability to annul any streamlined schemes after they've been made by applying the negative resolution procedure. Secondly, Amendments 5 to 8 replace the decision-making power in Clause 16 in relation to the designation of marketable risk countries with a power to make regulations for the same purpose. And thirdly, Amendments 10 to 12 relate to the powers provided in Clauses 25 to 27 to change definitions of secondary legislation. Those powers will be removed. And finally on this group, Amendments 39 and 40 address concerns raised by the DPRRC over the secrecy of the financial stability direction-making power in Clause 47. These amendments make clear that such directions would need to be published in due course following their creation. In addition, my honourable friend, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, has written to the Public Accounts Committee and the Treasury Committee to commit to confidentially notify the chairs of these committees of the use of a financial stability direction. Finally, turning to Amendments 41 to 43 and 49 related to the Competition and Markets Authority and the Subsidy Advice Unit, while the Secretary of State could already direct the SAU to complete a monitoring report for a specified time period under subsection 4 of Clause 65, these amendments make specific provision on the face of the bill for more frequent scrutiny during the early years of the new regime. So instead of mandating a report within 5 years of the implementation of the regime, the table amendments require initial report after only 3 years, and then subsequently followed up with a further report after another 3 years, and then subsequent reporting will revert to the 5-year cycle. The Secretary of State will retain the ability to direct that a report is made for a specified period after the publication of the second 3-year report, and the sunsetting provisions in Clause 87, subsection 6, have been extended so that they take effect after that second 3-year report. Amendments 2, 3, 4 and 48 are minor and technical in nature. They clarify definitions under Clause 11 and 82. So, Mr. Speaker, in summary, I believe that this substantial package of amendments presents an improved set of measures that strengthens the new domestic subsidy control regime and makes it more transparent and more accountable. There will now be greater transparency of subsidies awarded and improved oversight and monitoring of the regime by Parliament and the CMA. I'm grateful to colleagues in both houses for their hard work and attention to this important bill. They've helped to bring about these improvements, and I hope they will be endorsed across this House. I beg to move that the amendments be agreed to.
The question is that the House agrees with Lords in their amendment. I now call Shadow Minister Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to speak in the debate today. And could I just start by acknowledging all the efforts that have gone on in the other place, and to thank all the peers and the staff, the civil servants who have helped move this bill along to the stage that we have now reached, and indeed colleagues on all sides of the House and all the opposition parties as well. Because Labour has outlined through this bill's process, we support the principle of a quicker, easier subsidy regime now that we have left the EU. However, we recognise that any subsidy regime must provide sufficient transparency and accountability for the spending of billions of pounds of public money each year. We have also repeatedly raised our concerns that this regime has failed to match up to the government's levelling up rhetoric. We are pleased to see that many of the Lord's amendments, which I will speak to in my speech, and including our amendment to Amendment 13, do improve the bill in some of these areas. But I want to just turn briefly to areas where we would like to have seen the government go further, and I would be grateful for the Minister to comment on these issues today. The first is on net zero. Labour has been clear that while this is framework legislation, it should not be an empty vessel. The government should have used the opportunity of an independent subsidy policy to design a regime which supported its wider industrial policy and our national priorities. We were also disappointed that the subsidy control bill was not published alongside a subsidy strategy. Net zero is a good example of this. The climate crisis is the greatest long-term threat facing our country and the world, so we need urgent action to drive down emissions in this area. This is why at committee stage we called on the government to support our amendment to hardwire net zero into the principles that public authorities have to consider when awarding any subsidy or designing any scheme. There was cross-party and cross-bench support for a similar amendment in the other place. The government's response was that the bill already contains a set of specific principles that apply to subsidies relating to energy and the environment. But this is far too narrow a view of climate impact. Net zero should be a consideration for public authorities on all subsidies, from public transport to supporting R&D in our energy-intensive industries. In rejecting both amendments, the government has missed an opportunity to use subsidy policy as a tool in achieving their own net zero targets. As I turn to the amendments, Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me not to also mention the recent scandal of P&O ferries and the implications of this bill, for which I have raised with the Minister. P&O Ferries is owned by DP World, the operator of the Southampton and London Gateway shipping terminals. As of today, DP World is still a partner on the London Gateway Freeport and is potentially set to benefit from the £25 million worth of public funding. This is a company whose senior executives have admitted to this House that they broke employment law and they would be benefiting directly from public funding of the government's new freeports. Now, beyond freeports, P&O Ferries itself has received £15 million of government support since the start of the pandemic, both through FOLO and through the freight subsidy scheme. As the Minister will know, UK public procurement law contains grounds which bar businesses from bidding from public contracts. Picking one example, a bidder can be excluded because they have breached national minimum standard. A bidder can be excluded because they have breached national minimum wage legislation. By contrast, this bill affords no power to the Secretary of State or to the public authorities to exclude DP World from the receipt of public subsidies. So I would be grateful if in his response the Minister could set out how he will ensure that subsidies are not provided to firms that do not meet a set of minimum expectations, including complying with the laws of this country. And finally, on the areas carried over from previous debate as well, on devolution, it is a disappointment that we haven't seen more movement on powers for devolved administrations, and we will continue to push on this, as the Minister, I'm sure, will be aware, as the bill moves forward to become an act on its implementation. Now, on the financial thresholds for reporting, throughout the bill's progression, Labour has raised concerns that the £500,000 threshold for publishing subsidies on the database, or up to £500,000, and the gobsmacking £14.5 million threshold for subsidies to services of public economic interest were far too high. There were cross-party efforts to introduce greater transparency into the database from us in committee, from the honourable member as well, from Aberdeen, the colleagues from Aberdeen, and I also pay tribute to the members for Weston-super-Mare and Thirkst and Moulton for their work in this important area. I know the Minister has already paid tribute to those efforts. In the Commons, calls to lower these monetary thresholds were resisted by the government, but we were pleased to see in the Lords that the government amendments 14 and 25 took heed of our calls as well and lowered the threshold for publishing subsidies on the database to 100,000. Lords Amendments 26 to 30 and 32 lower the threshold for publishing subsidies to services of public economic interest to 100,000. Whilst we welcome the reductions in the reporting thresholds, we are concerned that Lords Amendments 22, 33, 40, 34, 35 and 37 allow them to be changed by the government without good reason. Now, having accepted the premise of greater transparency, could the Minister explain under what circumstances the government would seek to change the thresholds? Without a clear explanation, we are concerned about why the government felt the need to keep these powers in reserve. Now, on time thresholds for uploading onto the database. Mr. Speaker, throughout the bill's progression, Labour has been clear that the 6-month deadline for publishing subsidy details on the database was simply far too long. Without their publication, interested parties have no way of identifying subsidies that may be harmful, and 6 months is enough time for damaging subsidies to inflict significant harm on competitors and more broadly on British competition and investment. We therefore support Lords Amendments 17 and 20, which reduce the publication deadline to 3 months, and Amendment 19, which states that any modifications made to subsidies have to be also uploaded within 3 months. Though Labour would go further in reducing these timeframes, we welcome these amendments. We also support Lords Amendment 16, which sets a 3-month deadline for uploading tax schemes onto the database. However, Amendments 15 and Amendment 18 still provide public authorities with 1 year to upload a tax subsidy onto the database and 1 year to upload modifications in relation to tax subsidies. So could the Minister explain why there is still this 9-month difference between the deadlines for publishing tax subsidies and publishing tax schemes, and why the government is allowing such a long period for modifications in relation to tax subsidies? Now, on to audit. As well as calling for publication deadlines to be reduced, the Minister will know that Labour also called for the Secretary of State to take ownership for the transparency database and what is uploaded onto it. The government has recognised in its white paper on Companies House reform the dangers associated with creating a register without a regulator, and yet risks making the same mistakes here. The information uploaded and published onto the database is crucial for alerting interested parties to potentially damaging subsidies. If the information on the database is not accurate or complete, there is no transparency or accountability. Laws Amendment 13 goes some way to ensuring the Secretary of State reviews the database, but we are concerned that this amendment is too vague. The amendment doesn't make clear what the purpose of the review is, who will conduct it, or how regularly. So Labour have tabled Amendment A to Amendment 13, which clarifies the purpose of this review is for the Secretary of State to ensure the accuracy and completeness of the information in the database. This amendment has been tabled in a constructive spirit in order to clarify the legislation. Whilst improvements have been made to the database, and we acknowledge that, since the evidence we heard at committee about its serious deficiencies, practitioners continue to have concerns. Currently, the name of the granting authority is not included in all entries. This is clearly a major gap, as it is the key piece of information an interested party wishing to challenge a subsidy in the very short window available to them needs. Now, turning to laws amendments regarding the Competition and Markets Authority. Amendments 41 and 42 mandate that the CMA lays its first report on the regime 3 years after the bill commences, and its second report 3 years after that. Increasing the frequency of the CMA's reporting is something I raised during committee stage, and I am pleased to see that it has been taken up. We also support Amendments 43 and Amendment 49. However, under the bill, the CMA only has the power to report on subsidies and schemes which are reported to it. As we have heard from experts, that leaves a black hole for accountability, Mr. Speaker, where a public authority wrongly concludes that it is not granting a subsidy. These payments would not be published onto the database, and interested parties will therefore not be able to challenge them. During committee stage, Labour tabled new Clause 3, which would have given the CMA the power to investigate subsidies that may be of concern and subsidy schemes on its own initiative. This is an issue which the Laws Amendments have unfortunately failed to address. Let me speak to the areas of regional economic disadvantage. Mr. Speaker, the issue of regional economic disadvantage has seen some progress during the passage of the bill in the other place. There was anxiety that the Minister will have heard as well from devolved administrations and from members across this House about the implications of the loss of assisted areas. The bill as introduced contained no measures to ensure that subsidies could and would be used to reduce economic disadvantage both between and within regions in the UK. Regions and nations of the UK. At second reading and committee stage, I stress that the bill failed to live up to the Conservatives' levelling up rhetoric. I am therefore pleased that the Lords tabled Amendment 9, which removes the relocation prohibition on subsidies that work to reduce social and economic disadvantage. Labour also tabled an amendment to Schedule 1, which would have explicitly added addressing a local or regional disadvantage as a policy objective that subsidies can pursue. This was voted down in the Commons, but I am pleased to see it was accepted by the Government in the other place with the tabling of Amendment 50. Over 300 pages of the Levelling Up White Paper don't reference subsidies once, but I look forward to the Government bringing forward details of how subsidy policy will be used to achieve its objectives. Now, just speaking briefly on the subsidy schemes and subsidies of interest, the amendments relating to these we support. There's Amendments 1 and Amendment 4. We are concerned, though, about streamlined subsidy schemes and about when streamlined subsidy schemes will be put in place. These schemes will be important for granting authorities who will use them to avoid unnecessary bureaucratic workloads. So can the Minister lay out when details of these streamlined subsidy schemes will be published? Practitioners have expressed concern to us that Clause 72 is not clear enough on the power to challenge an individual subsidy made under a scheme and when the clock starts ticking on that period of challenge. As drafted, the bill appears to indicate that a scheme can be set up and then, say 2 years later, a damaging subsidy can be made under that scheme. As the deadline for challenging the scheme itself will have already passed, there will be no mechanism for interested parties to challenge this harmful subsidy. I'll be grateful if the Minister could confirm if he's aware of this problem and if he's taking any action to address it. And other amendments, finally, Mr Speaker. Multiple technical amendments have been made to this bill by the Lords. We support all of these amendments, amendments 2, 3, 10 to 12, 5 to 8, 39 and 40, 44 and 51, and the greater scrutiny they add to the bill. However, Amendment 46 allows the Secretary of State to rely on consultation carried out before the bill receives royal assent when issuing guidance. Ongoing engagement with public authorities and business is critical, and I hope the Minister can reassure the House that the Government won't be ducking this obligation. In conclusion, Mr Speaker, Labour recognises the need for this legislation. It is necessary to meet our international obligations. More than that, it is necessary to protect the UK's internal market and to ensure that public funds are being made available to firms with appropriate safeguards being put in place. The Lord's amendments may not go as far as we hoped in some cases and on devolution as well, but they nevertheless significantly strengthen this bill, providing the scrutiny and oversight that Labour has called for from the beginning. However, it is regrettable that concerns including around the CMA's powers and net zero were not addressed. Well-designed proportionate subsidies are a critical part of an effective industrial strategy to grow our sectors of the future and to invest in our transition to net zero. The Government now needs to bring forward a plan to make that happen. Thank you.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. It's very good to be here to be talking about the Subsidy Control Bill again. The Lord's amendments that have been accepted and put forward by the Government do make this bill better. The bill is better as a result of almost all of the amendments that have been put forward, and I agree and accept that that is the case. I feel quite sorry for the Minister because he had to argue against many of these amendments during the course of committee stage and report stage, and now they're in the bill and he's arguing for them, which is great. I'm glad he's arguing for them now, but you know, I feel he's been put in a pretty unfortunate position here on this. Although the amendments do make it better, the bill still falls very far short of where the subsidy control regime for the UK should be. There are a number of significant issues and areas that we still have major concerns about. I would like to recognise the improvements that have been made to the transparency section, particularly Amendment 14, which is one that I wrote for committee, so I'm very pleased to see that the Government have put it forward and it is on the now in the bill. That Amendment 14 is about reducing the threshold for subsidies to be put in the transparency database from 500,000 to 100,000. That's incredibly important. It needs to. The database is only going to work. We're only going to know what subsidies have been granted. We're only going to know if subsidy schemes are working or subsidies are working in the way that the Government intends them to, if we can see which subsidies are being made. And at the threshold of 500,000 was just too high for us to have a good enough overview of that. And that's without talking about the issues of the lack of ability of people to challenge subsidies if they don't know about their existence. And setting the threshold at 100,000 makes it much less likely that a company will be so badly damaged by a negative subsidy, by a harmful subsidy, and they're then unable to challenge that because of the lack of transparency around it. That is one of the places that has been improved. I'm also pleased to see that CMA reporting has been reduced to 3 years. Again, that's another thing that I moved in committee, although I moved 2 years. We can meet in the middle at 3. I'm pleased to see that that reporting is going to happen, particularly in that initial period. It's really important that we know how that subsidy schemes are working, how the database is working, and whether or not any, how challenges are working to that. This legislation is only going to work if it is kept under review, and I'm pleased also that there is an amendment to that effect, looking at the Secretary of State's ability to review the database. Pleased also that is in there, because I think it is necessary. It's going to move and change. Things are going to need to be improved. This is not going to be the end of the story for subsidy control. This is not going to be, we're not just going to put this on the statute book and that's it. As has been said, there's going to be a lot of consultation. There's going to be a lot of guidance that is going to come out. There's still a significant amount of this that is going to come in guidance. And I'm pleased actually about the amendment that was just mentioned by the Labour front bench. That means that the consultation, or a significant portion of the consultation, will happen in advance of the bill being put into force. I think that is important. That's actually something we pushed for in committee, because authorities that are going to be granting subsidies and those that are going to be receiving subsidies and those that may be harmed by subsidies need to have an idea of what that's going to be before the regime kicks in. And I think doing that consultation as early as possible is really, really important. Getting the guidance published as early as possible is also really important. I would urge the Minister to make good on the promises that he made around ensuring that guidance is out in good time, so that everybody can make the regime work. The regime is only going to work if people know how it works, if they've got the guidance in place so that they can do it. The last few things that I want to mention are around challenges. I still think there is some lack of ability for people to challenge, both in the length of time that they've got to challenge it, but also in the people that are named on the face of the bill in order to make challenges. I would have liked to see the challenges, the Scottish Government, the Welsh ministers and the Northern Irish ministers mentioned on the face of the bill as those that can make challenges by right, no matter, without having to demonstrate that they have individually been affected by the subsidies that have been put in place. The other couple of things, agriculture. It's disappointing to me, Mr. Speaker, that agriculture continues to be included in this, given... Absolutely.
On that issue. Thank you. I thank the Honourable Friend for giving way. I wonder, I mean, I am extremely disappointed that the Scottish and Welsh governments, NFUs across these islands, including NFU Scotland's views and concerns about agricultural subsidies being included within the scope of this bill have been virtually ignored by this government. And certainly there's no reflection of it on the face of the bill currently. Does she share those concerns?
I absolutely do, and the Minister or the Government can't hide behind the fact that this is in the TCA, because the TCA specifically says that agricultural subsidies can and should be excluded from subsidy control regimes. So the Government still haven't given a good reason for including agriculture in subsidy control regimes. It's something that works in the EU, it works in the state aid, it's perfectly workable to exclude agriculture from this, and it's going to cause problems. You know, the fact that NFUs across these islands have raised concerns shows that it is incredibly serious, and I would really urge the Minister to have a rethink about how agriculture is treated in this bill. The last thing I want to talk about is net zero. Net zero was mentioned quite extensively by the Shadow Minister, but I want to say that there are requirements for granting authorities to look at environmental impacts and net zero impacts of energy-related subsidies. Now, this is not what net zero is about. This is not the only times that we're going to be thinking about how to reduce our impact on climate change. So, for example, if a granting authority decides to put on a bus, right, it decides to give significant amounts of money to bus companies, they don't have to look at whether or not what the climate impact of that is. If they decide that they're going to scrap all the buses and put on taxis instead, and exclusively have diesel taxis, because it's not an energy-related subsidy, the granting authority does not even have to consider the net zero impact of this, or the lack of net zero impact for this. So I'm massively concerned that it's not included in Schedule 1, and it's only included in the Schedule 2. If the Government is serious about tackling climate change, it needs to be looking at every single piece of legislation that comes through this place and ensuring that it doesn't have a negative impact on our ability to meet net zero. Or if it does have a negative impact on our ability to meet net zero, that is then balanced by further more dramatic actions in order that we can meet that net zero. In summation, the bill is better than it was. It still falls far short. Still concerned about transparency. I'm still concerned massively about agriculture, and I am hugely concerned about this government's lack of importance that it is given to net zero. It should be through every single thing that we do. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Right, with leave, I'll bring in the Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank all the honourable members for their engagement right the way through all of this passage, and indeed for the contributions this afternoon. Just to, I'm glad that there's been broad consensus, albeit with some questions which I'll try and address very briefly. And the importance of that new independent subsidy control regime has been clear throughout the passage of the bill, and that was evident again today. So I'm thankful to the honourable members for their broad support. But in response to the honourable member for Feltham Heston's question about P&O and that kind of example, clearly we're shocked by the action of P&O ferries and angered by the lack of empathy and the consideration that P&O ferries have demonstrated towards their own employees. Now, the government's continuing to work to establish whether P&O or DP World are in any breach of any of the requirements on them as partners in the Thames and Solent free ports. But speaking more generally, I can confirm that the bill ensures that public authorities can recover a subsidy where the subsidy has been misused, but it's important to note that the purpose of a subsidy is actually to achieve specific change in behaviour to facilitate a specific policy objective. It's not to give the government ongoing leverage over how a company conducts its affair. It's for other areas of law to set out the limits of what's acceptable corporate behaviour. But nonetheless, as I say, we will make sure that within this, because it's there to actually have that specific policy objective, we need to make sure that policy objective is still met. As best we can, but it is difficult to enforce. Yeah, I'll happily give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Could he? I'm grateful to him for his consideration of this point, but could he clarify if that could still effectively mean that a company that breaks the law, doesn't meet minimum standards around employment law or other areas, environmental law, could still be in receipt of public subsidies through the subsidy control regime?
It's difficult to come up with examples, but essentially it's, as I say, a subsidy is there to determine a particular policy objective. Now, we would want to partner with businesses and companies that are most likely to deliver policy objectives, those policy objectives, reliable partners. Now, clearly, ones that are in breach of the kind of examples that she says are less likely to be those reliable partners. I mean, technically, I think she's correct. It's how you actually enforce something probably after the event, in the same way that had we given P&O ferries a subsidy last year, would we have been able to get that subsidy back? Probably not. But that's the difficulty within actual enforcement after the event. But nonetheless, I think the sentiment is absolutely there that we do not want to be partnering with companies to achieve our policy objectives that are unreliable. I'll happily give way.
The issue with that is that if they are given money to run a free port and they run a free port with that money, then they can sack all the staff that they like in P&O and still be eligible for the subsidy. The issue is there's a gap here that I think has been really well highlighted by the Shadow Minister.
And this is something we'll obviously work out how the subsidy control regime is working. This is part of what I'll come back to in a minute about the CMA's approach to report back how the subsidy control regime is working. Because what we've got to make sure is, excuse the pun, it's watertight if we're going to go down the road of making sure that we can recover any subsidies. But actually, I suspect there will be other areas of law that will be better suited to approach that, rather than specifically within this framework bill that we've got at the moment. Let me just cover a couple of the other periods at the moment, because I'll give one more way, because I don't want to be too long.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and I thank the Minister. If I could just make this brief point just for clarity, I think there is also a very important distinction where there are companies or businesses that the government may be working with to achieve policy objectives, and their eligibility still to receive public subsidies, potentially to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds or millions, and where they've explicitly even admitted to this House that they have broken employment law. I think there's a very important distinction here about how public money could be spent and effectively rewarding those that have got bad behaviour.
Thank the Honourable Lady. This is what I mean about other areas of law, because other areas of testing the value of the use of public money, frankly, will be better suited for addressing exactly those points. But I very much take the point that she takes. I'll give her.
Would it not in future be possible for the government, when offering a subsidy to companies, to specify that they need to meet certain labour standards, so that then this would apply?
Well, again, that's this up for public authorities. The whole point about this regime, this framework, is it is a loose, permissive framework, rather than trying to recreate something more onerous and adding layer upon layer to recreate the EU state aid system. But nonetheless, I would expect, again, because of value for money and good governance, which are ultimately any public authority, whether national government or local government or other public body, would expect to have exactly that kind of criteria within its yeah.
Just on that, The Scottish Government asked that the free ports that were going to be in Scotland had green stuff in them and also fair work rules. And the UK Government said no. And now the Minister is saying that actually, yeah, we can totally do that. They definitely should be in it. This UK Government refused to let us have that in the free ports that were planned for Scotland.
Coming back to the pact, I'm not going to get involved in a wider discussion about free ports. I'm talking about a framework bill here, which is exactly why I said that it's other areas of legislation, other areas of governance that actually will better frame this rather than within this framework bill in the same. And I'm going well over time on this because I did want to cover some of the other areas. Net zero, we've talked about that. That was raised, and there are a lot of common sense principles in Schedule 2 already, which support the UK's priorities on net zero and protecting the environment. They require subsidies in relation to energy and the environment to meet one of the specified aims, such as increasing the level of environmental protection, and ensures that subsidies do not undermine the polluter pays principle. We talked about the tax subsidies, the timings as well. Clearly, within the timings of the tax subsidies, that still necessitates a longer period of time because of the fact that tax returns and these kind of things do take longer to actually go through the process rather than just the immediacy of a sponsorship through a subsidy or assistance that's maybe more of an immediate cash assistance. She talked about the CMA and thresholds and limitations. I mean, ultimately, that's what the CMA will be looking at anyway as they go as part of their reporting back on the regime, the overall effectiveness of the regime. So we'll always be able to look at how those thresholds, how those limitations are working in practice. And so we want to make sure that that can actually be put into place. But Mr. Speaker, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wish to conclude today by reaffirming what I set out in my opening remarks, that this bill creates a domestic subsidy control regime that will work for people and communities across the United Kingdom, creating a robust yet agile system that allows public authorities to provide subsidies where they are needed most. Now, the rigorous debates in both houses has resulted in that improved bill that we have before us today, so I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that this House agrees with the Lords in their Amendment 1. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. With the leave of the House, I will call the Minister to move formally that this House agrees with the Lords' Amendments 2 to 12. Minister to move formally. The question is that this House agrees with the Lords in their Amendments 2 to 12. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Does the Shadow Minister wish to move Amendment A to the Lords' Amendment? OK. With the leave of the House, I will put the question on the remaining Lords' Amendments together. Minister to move formally.
Formally.
The question is that this House agrees with the Lords in their Amendments 13 to 51. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. That concludes consideration of the Lords' amendments relating to the Subsidy Control Bill. We now come to the Building Safety Bill, Programme Motion number 3. Programme motion to be moved formally.
I beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Building Safety Bill, consideration of Lords' amendments.
Now.
Queen's consent. Prince of Wales consent.
Yeah.
Thank you. I must draw the House's attention to the fact that financial privilege is engaged by Lords' Amendments 6, 17, 22 to 30, 103, 104, 111 to 113, 116, 120 to 127, 137 and 138. If they are agreed to, I will cause the customary entry waiving Commons financial privilege to be entered in the Journal. We will begin with Lords Amendments A and B to Lords Amendments 93, with which we will consider the other amendments and motions listed on the selection paper. Minister, to move formally.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I must start today with a reminder of where all this started, where this journey started. 72 people lost their lives in the Grenfell Towers tragedy, the largest loss of life in a residential fire since the Second World War. And I know that all of our thoughts are with those families who have lost loved ones. The government are determined to ensure that a tragedy such as this never happens again, and I would like to start by thanking Right Honourable and Honourable members of this House, noble lords, cladding groups and industry stakeholders who have worked tirelessly on this landmark piece of legislation. And I remind honourable members that this bill not only creates an improved building safety regulatory system, but protects leaseholders who have become victims in the building safety crisis. We have stuck to my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State's principles around building safety, which are that we must make industry pay to fix the problems for which it is responsible, we must protect leaseholders, and we must restore common sense to the assessment of building safety risks, speeding up fixing the highest risk buildings and stopping buildings being declared unsafe unnecessarily. Of course.
For giving way, and I accept a lot of what he's saying is correct, that those who are responsible should pay, leaseholders shouldn't. But the group he missed out, well, actually one group who were particularly affected by Grenfell, and that's social housing tenants. Why is the Minister not prepared to offer them the same financial support that he's giving to leaseholders?
So I would say to the honourable gentleman, we're continuing to review all of this. The whole of the affordable housing and social housing area we are looking at, we are consulting, and we will come back to ensure that we get this right.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and the Chairman of the Select Committee and I have been involved in the pre-legislative scrutiny and the whole process behind this. Is my honourable friend saying today that not only if we pass this bill as it's now amended and with the government amendments, that he's going to continue to look to revise the law to embrace more people within the law as in secondary legislation?
So what I'm saying is, so first of all, we obviously have the building regulator. The building regulator will be continuing to make sure that all building safety regulations are adhered to, but we also need to look, as we go further down the line, and the mention has been made of social housing tenants, and social housing and affordable housing, that we will be consulting on further so that we can absolutely sure we've got this right. I hope that reassures my honourable friend. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, wrote to honourable members on the 13th of April, updating on progress with industry negotiations. We will now see the vast majority of developers fix all buildings they had a role in developing or refurbishing in the last 30 years. My right honourable friend announced last week that in addition to the existing Building Safety Fund, the Government will establish a new cladding remediation scheme funded by industry contributions to cover all other unsafe 11 to 18 metre residential buildings containing private leasehold properties, those where a developer has not accepted responsibility for fixing them or cannot be identified. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Minister for giving way on what he's saying on that point. He'll be aware that I've had significant issues with this in my own constituency, many developments affected, and in one of them in particular, the Celestia development, there has been long-standing challenges in getting answers to the questions that residents there are asking. Redrow wrote to the Secretary of State saying that they would now take responsibility for paying, but they haven't made clear whether that applies to Wales. The letter only refers to England, and I wondered whether he could clarify whether he understands those commitments are going to be UK-wide, given this is a UK-wide issue, and if not, what pressure he could put on them to make sure that that commitment applies to Wales as well.
I don't know the specifics, if I'm being really honest with him, because he'll know that I've been picking this up lately, but if you wouldn't mind, I will come back to him with a definitive answer. Thank you. The leaseholder protections introduced in the other place put these commitments into law, qualifying leaseholders defined as those living in their own homes or with up to 3 UK properties in total in buildings over 11 metres or 5 stories, will be legally protected from all costs associated with the remediation of unsafe cladding, as will all leaseholders in buildings owned by or associated with the developer. Leaseholders in buildings above 18 metres are already protected by the government's £5.1 billion Building Safety Fund for the removal of unsafe cladding. It is the government's expectation that developers will pay to fix buildings they had a role in developing or refurbishing.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. Has it been possible to trace any foreign companies or foreign interests that are also partly involved in this, and will they be making their fair contribution?
My right honourable friend raises a very important point, and I'll be coming on to that specific point later on in my contribution. We are also protecting qualifying... Yes, give way.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. I think he's been a breath of fresh air since he's gone into the department, and the discussions have been very productive. Would he just clarify for us from the dispatch box that leaseholders in buildings under 11 metres, which currently have no protections, the department would be willing to look at those buildings on a case-by-case basis if they did need support?
Yes, well, can I say to my honourable friend, I know he's invested a considerable amount of time in this campaign, and I have also enjoyed the opportunity to have those discussions with him. I will come on to that point shortly, but yes, we will deal with those as a department on a case-by-case basis, and I will give a few more details as to why we've come to that conclusion. We are also protecting qualifying leaseholders from costs associated with non-cladding defects, including interim measures such as waking watches. Building owners and landlords will be prevented from passing on costs to fix these non-cladding defects where they are linked to or are the developer. During the passage in the other place, the government made a number of amendments to the bill that will restore fairness to the system and help those unfairly impacted by building safety issues. I know that many members want to speak, so I do not propose to go through each of the amendments made in the other place. Not only does the bill provide for a new regulatory regime, but it now provides an extensive set of tools in law to ensure that those who bear responsibility for defects are made to pay and to protect leaseholders from crippling bills for historic defects. In response to concerns raised by members in both houses and stakeholders, we have changed the way the building safety charge works, and we have removed the legal duty to appoint a building safety manager. Before I do move on to the amendments, I will give way to my honourable friend.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. We know that the EWS1, which was brought about by the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, has caused a lot of problems for people trying to sell their properties. We've now got PAS 9980. That won't replace EWS1, but could the Minister say that from his perspective he would rather people look at PAS 9980 as opposed to the EWS1?
Pay tribute to my honourable friend because I know he's equally been heavily involved in all of this work, and yes, I can confirm that, and I will elaborate a bit more later on in my speech. Where was it? In response to concerns... I will now turn to the government amendments to Lord's amendments brought from the other place. Lord's Amendment 94 inserts a clause setting out that the meaning of relevant building. The clause defines the categories of buildings the leaseholder protection measures apply to. The government originally proposed to apply the leaseholder protection measures to buildings containing at least 2 dwellings above 11 metres in height or with at least 5 stories. Amendments made in the other place extended the definition of relevant buildings to buildings of all heights containing 2 or more dwellings. We will be taking a very dim view of freeholders who seek to exploit leaseholders to pay for unnecessary works. The department is aware of a handful of low-rise buildings where freeholders have been commissioning such works, and we are addressing such buildings, as I said a moment ago, on a case-by-case basis. But we must restore proportionality to the system. That is why the government does not agree with the extension of the scope of leaseholder protections to include buildings under 11 metres. There is no systematic risk of fire with buildings below 11 metres. Low-rise buildings are therefore unlikely to need costly remediation to make them safe. Lower cost mitigations such as fire alarms are likely to be far more appropriate and proportionate. Assessments carried out in accordance with the new PAS 9980 principles should produce more proportionate responses than costly and ultimately unnecessary remediation. The Government has been clear in its view that an EWS1 form should not be required in buildings below 18 metres in height.
And giving way again. I just wondered, what is his advice to leaseholders who believe that they have been wrongly charged for unnecessary works or works that are not actually required in the way he's describing? Because I've had many examples raised with me of residents raising concerns about what has been put forward and whether that was actually required. What should they do? What's the practical advice?
Well, let me say, my door is always open, so if he wants to raise specific cases with me, I would be more than happy to take those up and make sure that we get the relevant answers for him. Freeholders and landlords should not be commissioning costly remediation in buildings below 11 metres except in exceptional circumstances. That is where there is no more proportionate option available. And they certainly should not be pointing to old WS assessments to justify those costs. Given the small number of buildings involved, a blanket legislative intervention bringing hundreds of thousands more buildings into scope to deal with an issue affecting just a handful of buildings would be entirely disproportionate. The Government amendments therefore reinstate the definition of relevant building as one that is at least 11 metres or 5 stories in height and contains at least 2 dwellings. Of course.
I'm extremely grateful to him for giving way. Has the Government made an estimate, in respect to the point that he's just made, of the number of residential buildings below 11 metres where there may be a case for extensive remediation works? Because I'm just trying to follow the logic of the Government's position. On the one hand, it says we don't think that there is really a problem in buildings below 11 metres, and therefore, on the other hand, we don't want to include them, because if there isn't a problem, surely the Government wouldn't actually be having to do much in respect of those buildings, because there are very few of them, so the Minister says.
I think the issue is the proportionate measures that can be made in those buildings to ensure that they are safe. We want to ensure, though, that we get this right, and we will be continuing to look at all of these. And if it becomes, you know, if even through the building safety regulator, they assess that there may be some further work that needs to be done or government to look at, we will absolutely make sure that we do that, and I will commit that to the House.
I'm very grateful for the Minister giving away again. On that specific point, I'm very grateful the Minister has said that he will look at this issue of buildings that are less than 11 metres. Will he commit as part of that to focus especially on those buildings where there are many vulnerable residents, whether that's care homes or shelter buildings or perhaps even schools where there are children with special educational needs or disabilities who might find it harder to escape buildings? Will he commit to look specifically to that lens of risk to the vulnerable adults in those buildings?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for her engagement too, and she raised this important point with me yesterday. Yes, absolutely, we've got officials looking at that, but also, as I say, the Building Safety Regulator will be assessing buildings like this, and if that becomes an area that needs further consideration, as I say, we will look at what measures need to be introduced. The Government, I'll do one more and then I must progress.
Thank the Minister for giving way. He's been very generous, but these are important and quite complicated issues. I think there was general welcome for the Government trying to take a more proportionate approach and moving away, albeit over a period of time, from EWS1 forms to PAS 9980, which can cover whole blocks rather than individual properties. The two questions the Select Committee asked on this that we haven't had answers to. First of all, would the Government now look at making the building regulator responsible for deciding which blocks need this new assessment, rather than the building owners, who might have a particular interest in saying no? And also, will he ensure that the professional indemnity insurance scheme also applies to assessors on the PAS 9980 assessments, as well as on the EWS1 forms?
So I know that the Department have been considering much of the excellent work that the Select Committee have been doing, and of course we've moved a long way from the initial reports, and the responses will be coming back to to the committee. Yes, I will take that away with me if he will allow, and I will write to him to give him further details. The government's original proposals, I'm moving on now to the leaseholder-owned, collectively enfranchised and common-hold buildings. The government's original proposal included an exemption from the leaseholder protection provisions to leaseholder-owned buildings, those in which the leaseholders have collectively enfranchised and those which are on common-hold land. In a collectively enfranchised building, the freehold is owned by some or all of the leaseholders. There is therefore no separate entity with which the cost can be shared. The leaseholders are the freeholders. The amendments made in the other place seek to apply the protections to these buildings. The government recognises that the amendments are well-intentioned and driven by a desire to protect these leaseholders, and the government shares these aims. However, I must emphasise to the House that these amendments will not have the intended effect of protecting leaseholders living in those buildings. Those leaseholders who have enfranchised would still have to pay, but in their capacity as owners of the freehold rather than as a leaseholder. Indeed, it could make things worse. Where some leaseholders have chosen to enfranchise and others have not, the enfranchised leaseholders would have to pay for remediation of the whole building in their capacity as owners of the freehold, including the share of remediation costs that would otherwise have been recoverable from those leaseholders who have not enfranchised, once they have paid up to any cap. That is why the government amendments reinstate the exemption for leaseholder-owned buildings. Enfranchised buildings are, of course, eligible for the £5.1 billion Building Safety Fund in the same way as other buildings, and the other protections we have introduced will apply. The recent commitment from many developers to fix their own buildings will apply equally to enfranchised buildings, and the measures and powers we have added to the bill to pursue and compel developers and cladding manufacturers to pay will be available. But I know that members will still be concerned about how we can protect leaseholders in leaseholder-owned buildings, and that is why I am announcing today that the government will consult on how best leaseholders in collectively enfranchised and common-hold buildings and other special cases can be protected from the costs associated with historical building safety defects. The consultation will allow the government to understand fully the position regarding leaseholder-owned buildings with historical defects and identify whether further measures are appropriate to address specific circumstances in which leaseholders may unintentionally be exposed to disproportionate costs. Moving on to...
I'm grateful for the Minister giving way, and he has to some degree covered the concerns I was going to raise about those people who have exercised right to manage, because he and the Secretary of State yesterday in the letter to us acknowledged that Amendment 117 from the Lords identified a real problem. Frankly, at this stage, a consultation is going to give very little comfort, but could he try to assure leaseholders in that position by saying how long that consultation will be undertaken and when they might expect some conclusion?
I appreciate the point that the honourable gentleman has made, and I will really want to ensure that we try and get this consultation underway as quickly as possible, because I do accept that there are concerns that are deeply held concerns for people, and we will do our best to get that as speedy as possible. And that's why I'm saying we do need to consult. We need to get the evidence. We need to know exactly what the picture is, so that we know then how best to perhaps deal with that situation. And moving on to Lord's Amendment 184, inserts new Schedule 8 remediation costs under qualifying leases. It sets out the circumstances in which costs cannot be passed on to leaseholders. The government's original proposal set out that where the building owner is linked to the developer or can afford to meet the costs in full, they would be prevented from passing costs on to leaseholders. It is worth stressing here just how wide these proposed protections are. If a building is still linked to the developer, that building owner and the landlord will be liable for the costs associated with non-cladding defects, and their leaseholders will pay nothing. If the building owner or landlord is not linked to the developer but has the wealth to meet the costs in full, their leaseholders will pay nothing. If a leaseholder property is valued at less than £175,000 or £325,000 in London, the leaseholder will pay nothing. And if the leaseholder has already met interim costs that exceed the contributions cap, they will pay nothing. Based on this waterfall, the government's assessment is that the vast majority of leaseholders would pay less than the caps, and many would pay nothing at all. But it is important to remember that not all landlords are evil. Where the building owner or landlord is not at fault, where they have no link to the developer who created these defects and do not have the wealth to meet the remediation costs in full, and only in this situation, we propose that leaseholder contributions towards non-cladding defects can be recovered, subject to the fixed caps. Importantly, yes.
Grateful to him for giving way, and apologies, I was at the rally with leaseholders earlier, so wasn't able to be here from the beginning. Does he agree that there is a real issue in terms of conflict of interest? Because often, and I've seen in my own constituency, a lot of cladded buildings, freeholders are the ones who are doing the assessments, and there is an independence in that assessment, which means that you don't have the necessary checks and balances. Does he agree that it's worth having a building works agency, as Labour's proposing, so that there are independent assessors who can do the work, so that residents can have the confidence that there aren't attempts to still find ways to pass on the costs to leaseholders? We've had 3 fires in my borough since Grenfell, and it's really vital that leaseholders do take the responsibility rather than passing the bill on.
She's absolutely right. Freeholders must make sure that their buildings are safe. We will have responsible people that are associated to each of those buildings to ensure that all of the regulations are adhered to. The building safety regulator as well will be making sure that buildings are safe. But as ever, we want to learn as this process goes on, and I'd be keen to continue to perhaps have dialogue with the Honourable Lady as we progress with this. Importantly, yes.
I thank you for giving way. He's very, very kind with his time. I'm just on the point about the building cost thresholds. He will know that the London median house price is £515,000. But in Runnymede and Weybridge, it's £475,000. In fact, house prices in my constituency are higher or equal to 25 London constituencies. So many of my constituents will be adversely affected. We will not get the same benefits as those in London, despite having equivalent or higher house prices. In that reviewing and going forward, looking at the policy, could he consider looking at house price on a regional basis as opposed to a inside London versus outside London basis, which negatively affects constituents such as mine?
I thank my honourable friend for raising that important point. He will be aware that actually what we're trying to do is avoid any of the leaseholders having any contributions to make at all. And the first port of call will always be the people who developed that in the first place. I hope to come on a bit later about the valuation of properties that might address some of his points. Importantly, we propose that those leaseholder contributions be subject to a firm cap, and that costs paid out in the past 5 years will count against the caps. The government originally proposed that leaseholders' contributions would be capped at £10,000 or £15,000 in Greater London, and we believe that creates a fair balance. It is the government's assessment that the vast majority of leaseholders would pay less than the caps and many would pay nothing at all. Nonetheless, the other place voted to reduce leaseholders' capped contributions to zero, and I'm afraid the government cannot accept these amendments. We believe that in these circumstances, setting the cap on leaseholder contributions to zero is not a proportionate approach. Placing the entire burden on freeholders and landlords in circumstances where they are not at fault and are not wealthy will only increase the risk that remediation that is needed to ensure that residents are safe will not happen at all. We are therefore restoring the caps at £10,000 outside London and £15,000 in London as originally proposed, and have made a small number of other technical improvements to these measures.
and I welcome him to his position on this very interesting bill which has gone back and forth. The one group of people that took the money right at the start for developers and builders was the insurance companies. They couldn't have built these properties without having the legal protection of insurance. And the Minister hasn't mentioned the insurance companies, sadly, once in this situation. That's where the burden should fall back on instead of the leaseholders. Will you not agree with me on that?
I think actually the responsibility lies with those who built the buildings defectively in the first place, and they are the ones that we are chasing. They're the ones, and that's why we've worked. And I have to say, I want to pay tribute, I should have said this right at the beginning, to officials in the department who have worked incredibly hard to get this new package of measures from the developers in place. It has not been an easy task. But they have done so with great passion and have been incredibly successful. And as I say, it is them that should be paying, and it will be a minimal number of leaseholders that we expect to pay. I'll be with.
I'm very grateful. I know you want to get on, but on the issue of insurance, which has been my bugbear as well, it's not just that many of these insurance companies insured the development beforehand, and therefore there were a warranty of sorts. But since then, they've increased premiums on leaseholders, sometimes by over 1,000%. So would the Minister have something to say about that particular activity from insurance companies?
Yes, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has asked the FCA to look at this because it is an area of great concern, of course, and I hope to update with further progress in the near future. Turning to Government Amendment A in lieu of Lord's Amendment 6, the Government has accepted the principle of the Lord's Amendment requiring the Building Safety Regulator to conduct a series of safety reviews. We believe the new version provides clearer drafting and a more practical and pragmatic approach. The amendment inserts a new clause that increases the time available to the regulator from 2 years to 3 years. This reflects the time needed for the regulator to develop the capacity to carry out these reviews alongside all its other functions. This new clause aligns the reviews with building regulations to address safety issues, focusing on the costs and benefits of measures to improve safety. It sets specific priorities for the regulator to review while fulfilling its duty under Clause 5 to keep the safety of people in or about buildings under review. The scope remains true to the intent of the original amendment. I think it is important to assure members that the reviews will be conducted within the principle of proportionality placed upon the operation of the regulator's building functions by this bill. I will now turn to a number of technical improvements the Government is proposing to Lord's amendments. Lord's Amendment 93 inserted the new clause called remediation of certain defects. The new clause provides an overview of the leaseholder protection measures contained within the bill. Government Amendments A and B to Lord's Amendment 93 makes two minor and technical amendments to that new clause. The first amendment, to leave out underqualifying leases at line 12, is a minor and technical amendment to reflect the fact that some of the protections in Schedule 8 apply to leases that are not qualifying leases. When the landlord is or is linked to the developer, they will not be able to pass costs on to any leaseholders in the building, including non-qualifying leaseholders. The second amendment at line 23 is a minor and technical drafting change. Trusts. I will now turn briefly to Government Amendments A, B and C to Lord's Amendment 98 regarding trusts. And I must take this opportunity to pass on my appreciation to the noble Lord Young of Cookham and Lord Blencathra, who raised this matter for their work in the other place across this bill. I acknowledge the concerns raised around the use of trusts and how their misuse could undermine the vital leaseholder protection provisions. The Building Safety Minister, my noble friend Lord Greenhouse, committed at report stage in the other place to consider this further. Government Amendments A, B and C amend Clause 120 to ensure that a body corporate or a partnership can be regarded as associated with another if they are the beneficiary of a trust which has an interest in a relevant building. In other words, the existence of a trust will not enable a group of companies to evade their responsibilities under the leaseholder protections. We have also inserted wording into Clause 130 so that beneficiaries of trust can be considered for building liability orders, that is, can be required by the High Court to contribute to remediation. The remaining amendments to Lord's Amendments 107, 108 and 190 are consequential to the amendments I have just described. Government Amendment 78A to Lord's Amendment 78 is a consequential on Lord's Amendment 59, which removes the building safety charge as a separate charge. This removes a reference to the building safety charge as a separate charge. Previously, the ongoing costs of the new regime were to be charged via a standalone building safety charge. We are changing this so that the building safety costs are an identifiable part of the service charge. This will keep costs transparent while allowing them to operate as part of the service charge system, which is familiar to both landlords and leaseholders. This amendment responds to the feedback we have received from leaseholder groups. We recognise the concerns that the building safety charge, as envisaged in the previous drafting of the bill, would have created additional bureaucracy for landlords and leaseholders alike, and we have listened to those concerns. In making this change, we have simplified how the costs of the new regime are managed. The service charge regime is well established, and this amendment reduces the bureaucracy of an entirely separate charging mechanism for building owners and leaseholders. Government Amendment A to Lord's Amendment 145 is a minor correction to reflect that there is no longer a regulation-making power at paragraph 4 of Schedule 8. The Government amendments to Lord's Amendment 184 are minor and technical amendments clarifying the no service charge is payable under a qualifying lease where the landlord at the qualifying time was responsible for the defect. I'd like to take this opportunity to again say thank you to all members, particularly those for Worthing West, Stevenage, Southampton, Itchen for their work, and also additionally to my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, for very many helpful discussions that we have had recently. I'm sorry, I'll keep away.
For giving way, and we are primarily discussing measures the government are introducing for England only. And I know we can't answer for the Welsh Government, but what discussions has his department had with the Welsh Government about policy in Wales? And does he expect the Welsh Government to follow the measures that he's introducing today for England? And does he have a time frame about when that policy might be announced?
I think the honourable gentleman is right that it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speak on behalf of the Welsh Government. I don't think they would like that either. But you know, I think what is important here is that all buildings across the United Kingdom are safe, and I hope that we will all learn from each other to ensure that we achieve that objective, because it's the safety of those residents that is paramount in this instance. So, in conclusion, I hope that honourable members will welcome all the changes that the government has made, which I firmly believe address the key concerns that were raised in Parliament. I know that it is in all of our interests to see this crucial legislation become law as quickly as possible, and I very much hope all honourable members across the House will support the government amendments and look forward to seeing this legislation implemented so that we can get these buildings into a safe position and give those residents the reassurance that they need.
The question is that this House agrees with Government Amendments A and B to Lord's Amendments 93. Perhaps if people are hoping to catch my eye, they might just give me an idea. Thank you. Shadow Minister Matthew Pennington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This bill has been a long time in gestation. First published in July 2020, it was subject to extensive pre-legislative scrutiny and was examined in exhaustive detail over 5 long weeks in committee in the autumn of last year. Then, in January of this year, the government accepted that the approach they'd taken to the building safety crisis over a period of more than 4 years following the Grenfell fire had not worked, and they announced it would change. We raised a series of questions and concerns about what that change of approach would mean in practice, but we welcomed the fact it had finally happened. It is of course right that we seek to ensure that those who profited from the sale of unsafe buildings and construction products pay their fair share when it comes to putting things right. That every developer and freeholder who can shoulders the financial burden of fixing their own buildings. That we restore common sense and proportionality to the assessment of building safety in general. and that leaseholders are properly protected from the costs of remediating all historic cladding and non-cladding defects. Labour has urged the government to act on all these fronts and more for years, and we're pleased that we're now finally making progress towards some semblance of a comprehensive solution to the building safety crisis. But I must say to the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, the manner and the pace at which this already complex and technical piece of legislation has been overhauled to reflect the government's belated change of heart has been deeply problematic. Large sections of the bill have been completely rewritten on the basis of hundreds of government's amendments tabled in the other place, which their noble lords had relatively little time to consider carefully or properly scrutinise. We welcome many of those amendments, in particular the removal of the building safety charge and the abolition of building safety managers. And we also welcome the important concessions the government made in the other place in response to Labour amendments, for example, to exempt social housing providers from the levy. But that does not detract from the fact that this is no way to make good law. And I want to put on record, Madam Deputy Speaker, the opposition's serious misgivings about the way the government have gone about revising this legislation. As a result of the way the bill has been modified, it is now, by all accounts, something of a mess. And the 5 pages of complex government amendments tabled yesterday afternoon, again providing honourable and right honourable members on all sides of the House with little time to properly consider them, do little to remedy that fact. However, the opposition has always maintained that we want to see a version of this bill on the statute book as soon as possible. As such, our focus is now on ensuring its most glaring remaining defects are addressed so that it can be passed in what remains of this session. There are 5 specific issues to be considered today to that end. The duties placed on the building safety regulator when it comes to reviewing safety and standards, protection for leaseholders in buildings below 11 metres in height, protection for leaseholders in enfranchised buildings, the issue of buildings held in trust, and the proposed leaseholder cap. The first can be dealt with very quickly. As well as having the resource and capacity to perform all the complex tasks assigned to it, it is of critical importance that the new building safety regulator within the HSE be clearly tasked in the early years of its operation with assessing the benefits and costs of a range of measures in relation to safety and standards. Lord's Amendment 6 specified 4, namely fire suppression systems, the safety of stairways and ramps, the certification of electrical equipment, and provision for people with disabilities, and we supported it. Having maintained in the other place that the amendment was entirely unnecessary, the government yesterday tabled an amendment in lieu to Lord's Amendment 6 that almost entirely mirrors its provisions, and on that basis we will support that government amendment. Turning to the second issue under consideration this afternoon, that of protection for leaseholders in buildings below 11 metres in height. As I argued at report stage on the 19th of January, 18 metres was always a crude and arbitrary threshold that not only failed to adequately reflect the complexity of fire risk, but was an entirely unsound basis for determining which blameless leaseholders were and were not protected by the state from the costs of remediation. The same argument applies to the 11-metre threshold. Those blameless leaseholders who are trapped living in unsafe smaller buildings deserve the same protection as those in mid and high-rise unsafe buildings. As the Earl of Lytton argued in the other place, and I quote, "There seems to be no good reason for height exclusion on any moral, economic, safety or practical ground." The government maintain, and the Minister just said as much again in his remarks, that there are no systemic building safety issues with buildings under 11 metres. Yet we know from the devastating incident at Richmond House in Worcester Park in 2019 just how dangerous to life defective buildings under this height threshold can be. The government further maintains that buildings under 11 metres in height that are dangerous are few in number. I suspect that's almost certainly the case. But all the more reason then to provide financial support to those blameless leaseholders who do find themselves living in them, rather than leaving them without protection. Now, I noted what the Minister said when he gave a commitment that the government will review these buildings on a case-by-case basis. But it does beg the question, Madam Deputy Speaker, why won't the government act by amending this bill to cater for those exceptional circumstances he spoke about? I will.
Just on that point, does he agree with me that by not acting to safeguard those blocks, those who live in those kinds of accommodation are then going to find it very difficult to be insured and to get mortgages? So this is a short-sighted response when the government could actually address these issues in the round.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and it's been a consistent position of ours that we ensure that all leaseholders affected by the building safety crisis are protected irrespective of circumstance, including what height their building happens to be. For that reason, we will oppose Government Amendment A, tabled yesterday to Lord's Amendment 94, and seek to ensure it remains in the bill unmodified. Turning to the third issue we're considering this afternoon, the matter of enfranchised buildings. Under the provisions in this bill, enfranchised leaseholders will in effect be treated as freeholders when it comes to the costs of remediation. That cannot be right. Buildings which have exercised the right to collective enfranchisement, or those on common hold land, may be few in number, but it has been the policy of successive governments to encourage leaseholders to enfranchise and to promote the right to manage. Indeed, the government have promised legislation in the next session to make it easier and cheaper for leaseholders to buy the freehold of their building. Yet the government have put forward no solution whatsoever to the issue of enfranchised buildings in this bill as it stands, and are seemingly content, at least till this afternoon, to see those leaseholders completely excluded from the protections enjoyed by those in buildings which remain unfranchised. And we vehemently disagree with that position. It's imperative that these leaseholders be afforded the same protection as those who do not collectively own or manage their buildings. As Lord Young put it in the other place, and I quote, "It would be perverse if the legislation before us today put enfranchised leaseholders in a worse position than leaseholders who are not enfranchised." It is essential that the service charge protections set out in Schedule 8 of the bill apply clearly to enfranchised buildings and buildings where the right to manage has been exercised. And that's another reason we can't support Government Amendment A, tabled yesterday to Lord's Amendment 94, and why we will seek to divide on it. The Minister is right that pressing that amendment is not enough, and the Government are going to have to go further than simply accepting at some point Lord's Amendment 94 or a version of it. Because the bill in its current form would not prevent resident-owned companies from making unlimited demands on leaseholders in their capacity as shareholders to cover those costs that they would be unable to pass on via service charges if Lord's Amendment 94 or a version of it were to remain part of this bill. So they are going to have to act. I noted what the Minister said about a consultation, but I have to say I agree entirely with my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Central. It is too late in the day to be consulting on this matter. 4.5 years or more after Grenfell, the bill needs to be amended to reflect and deal with this issue. Turning forth to the fourth issue we're considering this afternoon, that of buildings held in trust. As it stands, buildings held in trust on behalf of a third-party investor, where the landlord is a professional depository or custodian regulated by the FCA, or buildings owned on trust by what I can only describe as ground rent grazers, almost invariably offshore-based, do not meet any of the association tests or the net wealth test in this bill. Unless the bill is revised to capture such trustee arrangements, they will escape the so-called waterfall system as set out in Schedule 8, and the leaseholders within them will find themselves picking up a proportion of the costs of non-cladding remediation. The Minister is right that in the other place the Government accepted that the bill needed to be so modified, and they tabled yesterday an amendment to Lord's Amendment 98 as a result. Madam Deputy Speaker, let me be clear. The inclusion of Lord's Amendment 98 as amended in the way the Government proposed would make for a better bill than no provision whatsoever addressing the trustee loophole. But the Government amendment tabled yesterday afternoon has serious deficiencies, almost certainly the result, and I make no charge against the officials involved when I make this point, of the hurried timescale in which it's been drafted and tabled. Let me take the two most obvious problems with it. First, the Government's amendment only covers partnerships or body corporates which are a beneficiary of a trust. Private individuals are entirely excluded. That cannot be right, and they must be brought within the scope of these arrangements. Second, the Government amendment makes no distinction whatsoever between types of trust. So a local authority pension fund, for example, will be liable under the waterfall in precisely the same way as an offshore ground rent grazer. We believe that that is wrong, and the Government should think further about how it might better protect trusts where there is a clear public interest in doing so. We won't oppose the Government amendments A, B and C to Lord's Amendment 98, but I urge the Minister and his officials to go away and consider whether the flaws in the Government amendment as currently drafted can be rectified as the bill progresses. Madam Deputy Speaker, turning to the fifth and final issue under consideration, the proposed leaseholder contribution caps. When it comes to the issue of leaseholder liability, Labour has consistently argued that all blameless leaseholders should be protected from the costs of remediating historic cladding and non-cladding defects and associated secondary costs, irrespective of circumstance. While we fully acknowledge that the waterfall system now set out in Schedule 8 provides leaseholders with a far greater degree of protection than the bill as originally drafted proposed, it doesn't protect them fully. Just as importantly, the bill does nothing to provide redress for those countless blameless leaseholders across the country who've already been hit with huge bills and have paid out significant sums of money as a result. That is why we support Lord's Amendment 184, which seeks to reduce leaseholder contributions to zero, and why we call once again on the government to think again about how leaseholders who've already paid to fix historic cladding and non-cladding defects can be provided with retrospective financial redress. The government's position is that leaseholder contributions are fair in principle because they will only apply in a limited number of cases. By the Building Safety Minister's own admission in the other place, leaseholders will only pay up to the cap or a proportion of the cap in, and I quote, a minority of circumstances. But that statement begs the obvious question, Madam Deputy Speaker, of why the government are so determined to force this minority of leaseholders, some of whom will be able to meet the costs of the cap, but others who will not, to pay, particularly given the amounts raised by cap leaseholder contributions will almost certainly never cover the full costs of non-cladding remediation works in any given building, and other sources of funding will have to plug the gap. In responding to Lord's Amendment 184 or 155 as it was in the other place, the Building Safety Minister seemed to suggest that if leaseholder contributions were set to zero in cases where there is no clear party that can pay, the full cost would be transferred back to the freeholder or the landlord, and the Minister said as much in his remarks earlier. Yet there is nothing on the face of the bill that provides for that to be the case. Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is entirely unclear precisely how the funding shortfall will be made up in these cases, and the same issue arises in the case of buildings with significant numbers of buy-to-let landlords. It surely can't be the case that the government ultimately intends to force local authorities to carry out remediation works on this minority of buildings. So one assumes the necessary funding shortfall will in the end be made up from some form of government grant using the funds raised by the expanded building safety levy and the residential property tax. But we can't be certain because the government haven't told us. This matters, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the real risk is that remediation works on these buildings simply never get done, with the leaseholders in them trapped in perpetuity. Assuming the government do believe it is critical that all unsafe buildings are remediated at pace, they need to tell us plainly what happens in cases where funding for historic non-cladding defects can't be extracted from the developer or the building owner, and where capped leaseholder contributions alone would not be sufficient. I hope the Minister can provide the House with some clarity on that point when he next gets to his feet, because it is one of the critical unanswered questions provoked by the government's recent change of approach, and the bill at present simply fails to engage with it. In these cases, when all other options have been exhausted and there is no clear party that can pay, which I remind the House again, the government itself asserts will be very small in number, we on this side believe grant funding should be provided because that is the only morally justifiable solution. And we want to see that backstop commitment written into the face of the bill. In sticking rigidly to its position that a minority of leaseholders will have to pay sums that, while capped, are still significant, to resolve a scandal they played no part in causing, the government aren't acting equitably, and they will not ensure that the most vulnerable leaseholders are protected as they claim. For that reason, we will oppose Government Amendments C and D tabled yesterday to Lord's Amendment 184, and we will seek to divide on them with a view to ensuring that all leaseholders are fully protected. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to end by paying tribute to each of the noble lords and baronesses who worked so constructively and on a cross-party basis to strengthen this bill, but also to all those resilient and determined individuals, many of whom have travelled to Westminster today to make their voices heard, whose unceasing campaigning has helped us arrive at this point. In no way does this bill represent a comprehensive solution to the building safety crisis, not least because that will depend on a range of non-statutory government interventions and the agreement, voluntary or otherwise, of banks and insurers. But it has been strengthened